world. Though Milken would have known the meeting was scheduled for later that day, and would probably have known its purpose. Shankman added, however, that when the SEC questioned him in connection with this investigation, he was shocked to learn from the government lawyer that Milken had bought these bonds from him, an institutional client, and put them into his personal account. Recalling his days at Lehman Brothers, Shankman said, "At most Wall Street FI-RMS. Certainly at Lehman. You could never have mixed professional and personal that way, buying securities for your account that you were trading for the FI-RM. There's too much opportunity for self-dealing." Somewhat rueful about having made that losing trade, Shankman calculated Milken's Professor IT as $635,500, and remarked, "People work a lifetime and never make that kind of money," and Mike made it in a 3-minute phone conversation. Finally, from the line of questioning at this deposition, it appears that Columbia Savings, First Executive, and the Princeton-Newport Limited Partnership, controlled by James Regan and Edward Thorpe, Milken's partners in Belvedere Securities, the Chicago brokerage firm in which he had the majority interest, may have done well, along with Milken, on the Caesars World Exchange. Milken was asked whether he had had any conversation about the Caesars World bonds with Tom Spiegel, Fred Carr, James Regan or Edward Thorpe between the time of his Caesars meeting and the announcement of the exchange offer about 2 weeks later. Milken testified that he had not. He was also asked if he was familiar with the sale of Caesars World bonds from the Drexel account of Prudential's high-yield fund, decidedly not an inner circle member, to the Columbia Savings account, about a week before the exchange offer was announced. Both accounts were covered by James Dahl, Milken's favored, super-aggressive salesman. Milken said he knew nothing about it. This was the kind of rumor that had swirled around Milken and his inner circle for years. That FI-RST he had created these players such as Spiegel and Carr, made them his captives with their pools of capital at his disposal, and then rewarded them further, sometimes personally. Other bond buyers speculated, with this kind of inside information. Regan and Thorpe were slightly different, insofar as they were not running financial institutions dependent on Milken's junk bonds but were money managers and Milken's partners in some of his lucrative investment partnerships. He could conceivably have Professor Ited directly from rewarding them. At the close of this deposition, when Milken was asked whether he had any knowledge of certain individuals or any interest in certain limited partnerships, which presumably had been buyers of the securities that were the subject of this investigation, one entity about which he was asked was One First National Plaza, Suite 2785, Chicago. The address of at least 2 Milken-Regan-Thorpe partnerships, Belvedere Securities and Dorchester Government Securities. "Don't recognize the name," Milken replied. One former Drexel employee, who was not aware of the Caesars World investigation, commented, "What I think may happen is this. An exchange offer is coming up, and Mike wants it to go well, have a high acceptance rate. So he gets his clients to buy the securities with advance knowledge that there will be an exchange offer in 3 weeks. That way, they all make out. Plus the exchange offer goes through." Even if all this were true, the government could pursue it as they did in Caesars World. But without an informant they would be hard-pressed to make a winning case. For Milken, as for Boesky, in the government's numerous investigations of him, prior to Dennis Levine's turning state's evidence, there was always a credible explanation for his having bought a security. What was telling in interviews with scores who knew Milken, however, was that so many thought he was not above reproach, simply beyond the reach of the law. Some thought that he would violate the securities laws because he had the archetypal outsider's disdain for convention and the established rule, because he believed he was responsive to some higher law. Some thought he would do it because he was increasingly possessed by the machine he had created and would do anything to fuel it. Some thought he would do it because he had the trader's compulsion always to beat his record, and, after 10 years of beating the previous year in a blinding winning streak, there was no way to go on beating it without having an edge. Almost no one, however, thought he would do it out of something as simple and base as avarice. In fact, many who know Milken marvel at how a man of such wealth can remain so indifferent to its usual pleasures. By 1986, a few close to Milken estimated his net worth at $1 billion or more. Moreover, it was said at Drexel that with the help of his brother, Lowell, he had been able to shelter much of it. But Milken was clearly not seduced by the material things his money could buy. For Milken, there was no equivalent of Ivan Boesky's statue garden, or Peltz's Palm Beach Palace, or even Icon's Fox Field. Milken's house in Encino is charming but unprepossessing, no 22-room manor house. It has no surrounding acreage for isolation but sits on a fully developed cul-de-sac where neighborhood children, and probably Milken's own, ride their bicycles up and down. He was said, by one client who visited his home, to have an old 19-inch color TV that was always on the blink, and to have only recently purchased a VCR. His home was decorated with inexpensive wicker furniture, no antiques, no art. Until lately, too, he had driven a dated Oldsmobile. The firm had finally prevailed upon him to get a driver, an insistence that may have been triggered by an auto accident Milken had in 1984, resulting in a lawsuit that he finally settled in the fall of '86 by paying $30,000. Now he owned a Mercedes turbo diesel and had a driver, but the driver was a concession to personal safety, and the antithesis of Milken's style. In another such concession, Milken had recently hired 4 bodyguards. His wife, Lori, who was Milken's high school sweetheart and, according to Steve Wynn, the only girl Milken ever dated, apparently had no greater desire for conspicuous consumption than her husband did. She was said to appear at black tie gatherings, such as those for the Simon Wiesenthal Foundation, the Nazi hunting organization, wearing a cloth coat and inconspicuous jewelry, while other women were swathed in furs and bore rock-sized gems. What Lori Milken did care about, apparently, was writing. It was said to be her consuming interest, and she had been enrolled in various writing workshops over the years. She wrote fiction, mainly short stories, apparently none of which had been published. Milken reportedly offered to buy her a publishing company, something she declined. There seemed to be, then, literally no personal use for the fortune Milken had built. He did contribute in a low-professor-ila way to certain causes, like the Simon Wiesenthal Foundation and, through the Milken Family Foundation, many programs in the field of education, both in California and nationally. But if he was a major philanthropist, that was a well-kept secret. While Milken apparently chose to not spend his money, however, he certainly had been driven to accumulate it from the very start. And, after all these years, he was still trying to shave every trade, still trying to milk his best clients. If we don't make money from our friends, who will we make money from? Still demanding everything but the first-born son in deals where he could get it. And still, in the view of one Drexel employee, shortchanging his partners. Michael has a deal with the firm on every LBO, said this employee. Michael, with his group, gets a piece. The firm gets a piece. A fund that corporate finance has gets a piece. Michael, of course, gets the lion's share. Then Michael goes and tells the client that 10% of the equity has to go to Drexel and 30% has to go to the investors, because they, the investors, need that much to get the proper risk-reward ratio for taking all this subordinated debt. Then he doesn't give the 30% to the investors. He gives maybe 10%. And the other 20% he squirrels away. That, this employee added, has caused tremendous ill will within the firm. Fred Joseph, knew about it, did nothing. It's like, a lot of people will cheat on their income tax. They figure it doesn't hurt anybody but the impersonal government, but not many people will cheat on their friends. In addition to being a talented, creative genius, he concluded, Michael is among the most avaricious, ruthless, venal people on the face of the earth. By 1986, it seemed to some who had known Milken for years that he, always wired, was now like a whirling dervish, spinning out to the very edge of control. One longtime buyer commented that there seemed to be less and less joy in Milken, something that had been part of him in the early years, and more compulsion. Others agreed that he was far more driven than when they had met him in the 70s, though even then he had been one of the most intense and kinetic people they had ever encountered. In a deposition taken during a 1980 SEC investigation, Milken testified that in 1979 he had had about 200 phone conversations on a routine day. Moreover, he added, while he was speaking to someone he could be carrying on 10 other conversations at the same time. I would say that I listen to no more than 25% of the conversations I have with anyone during the trading day. I would come in and out, buy and sell securities during any conversation. In an SEC deposition in 1982. During another investigation, Milken testified that he had about 500 phone conversations a day. And in a deposition in September 1986 he said he participated in, potentially 1,000 transactions every day. But this superhuman acceleration was not without its cost. If you talk to Michael for 3 or 4 minutes, said one associate, he can grasp what it may take other people hours or even a week to learn. But when you take 3 or 4 minutes down to 2 minutes, his reliability starts being worse. But he still wants to be in the decision process. Then he gives you 40 seconds, and his decisions are bad, made on too little input. Add to all that his imperialness and sense of his own infallibility. Out of about 30 or 40 conversations that this associate had with Milken on a given bond issue, he said they did not have more than 2 or 3 half-meaningful discussions. Most of those conversations lasted about 30 seconds. Conversations where you're on the phone with him and you don't know if he's listening to you or talking to someone else, covering the mouthpiece. You're talking, you niche making your point, and then he says, one of his most often used expressions, I'm back. By 1986, he concluded, Milken never had enough information. His retentive powers were amazing, but then that phenomenal repository got FILLED up, wasn't retaining any more. Some thought that Milken was increasingly out of touch, not only because he was operating at such velocity, but also because in his somewhat calmer moments off the trading floor he had succumbed to hubris. He had always cultivated a personal style that was modest, deferential. He liked to think that he appeared even humble. But years of rarely being challenged, of seeing his influence skyrocket, of having his acolytes and clients hang on his words, had taken their toll. So many treated him as though he were the oracle, and Milken began to act as though he were. Throughout 1985 and 1986, the chairman of American companies, not the Fortune 500, but sizable, $300 million companies, had been making the trek to Beverly Hills to pay homage. Milken would see almost no one during the trading day, so he scheduled these appointments before the market opened, starting at 4:30 a.m., and after its close. And there, in his throne room, he would finally forsake the 30-second bursts and segue into monologues on macroeconomics, on the state of the world, on whatever came into his imperial mind. On the final morning of the Tokyo Bond Conference in November 1986, the inaugural of Milken's effort to target Japan, having already captured so much of the domestic territory, Mike Mansfield, the crusty 87-year-old U.S. ambassador to Japan who had been a luncheon speaker at the Drexel Conference, invited Milken to a private breakfast meeting at the embassy. It was without specific purpose, a formal, courtesy visit. Such meetings have their own protocol. Polite conversation, phi-lled with give and take, not overextended. Milken, however, reportedly held forth for close to an hour in a monologue that barely allowed Mansef Ild to get a word in edgewise. Off and running, he is said to have pontificated until the visit's end on the economy, bonds, world politics, currency rates, macroeconomics. The gospel according to Milken. He had long been the fiscal evangelist, but now there was a self-importance which was blinding him, certainly to social conventions, and probably to much more. 15. Boesky Day. Drexel executives had just returned from the Tokyo Bond Conference in November, '86. Flushed with the success of that international inaugural. When, at the market's close on Friday, November 14, 1986, the day that they would thereafter refer to darkly as Boesky Day, the announcement came across the tape that Ivan Boesky had pleaded guilty to insider trading and had agreed to pay the largest fine ever, $100 million. He would, moreover, be cooperating with the government in its ongoing investigation of insider trading on Wall Street. At Drexel in New York, the leather-bound volumes of the $640 million much-disputed Boesky underwriting done in the spring of 1986 had been delivered that day to the OFF-ICE of Stephen Weinroth, the main investment banker on the deal, who would typically add these volumes to those of his other deals on his OFF-ICE shelves. Weinroth was not in the OFF-ICE. Hearing the news, his secretary put them in the closet. Over the next 4 months, Weinroth, who like several others is said to have argued against doing the Boesky underwriting, was responsible for its unwinding. In the end, the bondholders were made whole on their investment. It was Boesky's equity partners in his arbitrage fund who suffered losses, and who sued Boesky, Drexel, and Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver and Jacobson, the law firm that was counsel to Boesky in this and most other matters. When the unwinding was completed, in mid-March 1987, Drexel commemorated it not with the traditional deal paperweight, a lucite-encased miniature prospectus cover, but with a giant pink eraser, bearing the amount of the ill-fated offering in parentheses, $640 million. The Boesky-Milken relationship, however, was not so erasable. Within minutes of the announcement of Boesky's plea, the SEC issued subpoenas seeking information about trading in a dozen securities and the role in those transactions of Michael Milken, Carl Icahn, Victor Posner, Boyd Jefferies of the Los Angeles-based brokerage firm of Jefferies & Company, and others. Drexel executives knew then that their worst fears at the time of Dennis Levine's arrest in May, which had receded amidst the euphoria of the summer and fall of '86, had been realized. When Levine was arrested, the quick consensus at Drexel was that he would do anything, say anything, to save himself. He had been at Drexel for only a little over a year, however, and his colleagues in corporate finance in New York didn't think he had been close enough to Milken and his group to know much about what really went on in the Wild West. But what if he knew just a little? Or what if he made it up? Or what if he squealed on someone who did know? Through the summer, those whom Levine had earlier convinced to trade information with him, and whom he now was trading to the government, emerged to take their pleas. Investment bankers Ira Sokolow from Shearson Lehman Brothers, David Brown from Goldman Sachs, Robert Wilkes from Lazard Frères, and lawyer Elon Reich, Martin Lipton's protégé, from Wachtell, Lipton. With each successive revelation, however, the scandal seemed to move farther away from Drexel, becoming more and more the Wall Street scandal, and the Levine ring, moreover, appeared to have been comprised of second-tier M&A players. There was no hint of its touching the figure at the apex of that world. Then came Boesky. For years, other ARBs, investment bankers and traders had talked among themselves and, occasionally, on a background basis with this reporter and others about Boesky's trading on inside information. The shock that seized the street on November 14 was not at what Boesky had done, who had not surmised it, but at his having been caught. His prescient trading patterns had sparked SEC investigation after investigation, but until there was a cooperating witness in the person of Levine, the fortress had been impregnable. Now it was falling like a house of cards. Suddenly, most of Wall Street seemed vulnerable. Boesky, the biggest arb on the street by far, with hundreds of millions to bet, who lived and breathed the M&A game through all his frenetic, obsessive 21-hour days, had been at that game's nerve center. He had monitored it from his command post, where he stood for hours at a time, surrounded by computer screens flashing stock prices, manning a switchboard with 160 direct phone lines to stockbrokers, ARBs and others. There was not a significant M&A player on Wall Street who had not gotten the hyperkinetic Boesky's calls. And at least one star player, Martin Siegel when he was at Kidder, had long been rumored to have provided Boesky the inside information he continually sought. Now, like Levine, Boesky would doubtless offer up his Wilkises and Browns and Sokolos and Reiches. But just as Boesky had dwarfed them in Levine's trade, so would Boesky's ultimate target dwarf his middling ones. Because his ultimate target was the king. Boesky had been doing business with Milken since at least mid-1983, when Drexel raised $100 million for the Boesky-controlled Vagabond Hotels, a subsidiary of the Beverly Hills Hotel Corporation. In 1981, Boesky had gained control of the lush Beverly Hills Hotel from his in-laws after their patriarch, Ben Silberstein, died. In that vagabond offering, the proceeds of which were in part devoted to Boesky's risk arbitrage, Drexel in its time-honored tradition took as part of its fee a slug of warrants that gave it an equity stake in Vagabond, later renamed Northview Corporation. Then, in April 1984, Drexel had done a $109 million private placement of junk bonds for Boesky's arbitrage partnership. While $109 million seems paltry compared to the $640 million that Boesky would raise just 2 years later, at that time it probably comprised roughly 50% of his capital. So Boesky was relying heavily on Drexel for his funds. Interviewed in early 1984, Boesky's lawyer and close friend Stephen Frayden of Fried, Frank had listed Milken as one of a handful of people, important to Boesky, who knew him well. This friendship, or, more likely, this relationship based on mutual exploitation, since few more purposeful people than Boesky and Milken exist in this world, had begun even before Milken became the full-fledged maestro of the takeover world. But the relationship, and its potential for abuse, must have intensified once Milken possessed so much of the information the omnivorous Boesky craved. According to one associate of the two men, Boesky, who made it a point of pride that he slept only 3 or 4 hours a night, would call Milken, who did the same, most mornings as soon as Milken arrived at his desk, between 4 and 4:30 a.m. The relationship was fraught with a conference licit of interest potential that was extreme even for Milken. He, of course, would not have seen it as a conference licit. It had, rather, the synchronicity of interest that he had long cultivated in his interdependent universe, where he underwrote debt securities, and owned them, and owned those issuers' equity as well, and placed others' debt with those companies. Here Milken, and Drexel, not only underwrote Boesky's debt and probably owned some of it but had Professor IT participation in Boesky's arbitrage activities as equity holders. In those activities, Boesky was betting, in the kind of volume that could influence their outcomes, on the contests that Milken was strategizing and backing. They might be, if they so chose, perfectly complementary. And they had been, as Boesky began telling the government, or at least it appeared so from stories in the press, mainly those written by James Stewart and Daniel Hertzberg in the Wall Street Journal, during the 6 months after Boesky Day. Within the FIRST 2 weeks Drexel was identified as the subject of an investigation by the SEC and also a federal grand jury. By early February 1987, the outlines of what was reportedly the government's case were being sketched in the journal. The centerpiece of that case against Milken and others at Drexel appeared to be a $5.30 million payment made by a Boesky entity to Drexel in March 1986. As reported by Stewart and Hertzberg, that payment was questioned by Boesky's auditors at the accounting firm of Oppenheim, Apple, Dixon and Company. Boesky had told his auditors that it was for consulting. Unable to produce documentation explaining the payment, Boesky had then called Drexel's Beverly Hills ICE and obtained a letter, signed by Lowell Milken and Donald Balser, a member of the department, stating that the payment was for consulting and advisory services. Stewart and Hertzberg, however, quoted sources familiar with the government's case, who said that the payment appeared to be the settling of differences in a series of professor ITS and losses incurred by Boesky and Drexel, respectively. These professor ITS and losses apparently had resulted, sources said, from Boesky's having bought and parked stock at Milken's behest, and Milken's having done a similar favor for him. Parking refers to one investor's holding stock for another, in order to conceal the true ownership of the stock, and it typically involves the holders being guaranteed against losses. In some instances, these sources said, it appeared that Milken had not only agreed to protect Boesky from loss on the stock purchase Boesky made for him, but had promised him a percentage of the professor ITS on the eventual sale of the stock. Thus, to arrive at the $5.30 million, Boesky totaled the losses and professor ITS from the stock positions he had been parking for Drexel, and subtracted the percentage he was allowed to keep. If this were true, prosecutors would have a multitude of potential violations of the law to draw upon for indictments. Failure to disclose these arrangements in SEC filings, net capital violations, violation of prohibitions against market manipulation, of tender offer regulations, of record-keeping requirements, of prohibitions against falsifying documents, and of anti-fraud provisions of the securities laws, and conspiracy to commit any or all of these offenses. Beyond all this, if Boesky had parked stock for Drexel in the context of a coming takeover about which Drexel officials had inside information, then Drexel might be subject to triple damages under the Insider Trading Act for all or part of its professor ITS. There are numerous ways that such a reciprocal parking arrangement could have worked to Boesky's and Milken's mutual advantage. Boesky, who was always straining his net capital requirements with his gargantuan appetite, could have disguised the true magnitude of his holdings by parking them with Milken. Or he might not have wanted to make the required public 13D filing stating that he had acquired over 5% of a company's stock, if he were contemplating an acquisition. Boesky had said, in early 1984, that he intended to expand from arbitrage into merchant banking. Or he might have been buying stock on the basis of inside information about a coming deal, and he would have wanted to disguise his purchases so as to avoid SEC investigation. For his part, Milken might have wanted to park stock with Boesky if it were stock that Drexel was restricted from buying because of its knowledge of a coming deal. Or Milken might have wanted to seem not to own stock but have it on call to pressure a targeted hostile takeover subject as in, for example, the Wix situation. Or he might have wanted, as was allegedly the case in Victor Posner's acquiring control of Fischbach, to have freed Posner to act via a stock purchase, one he was unable to make himself. For Milken, deftly moving his players across the board, strategizing many moves ahead, The potential uses for disguised stock purchases were myriad. Fischbach was among the 8 stocks that Stewart and Hertzberg listed, in articles in the journal, as allegedly having been involved in the $5.30 million payment. The others were Gulf Plus Western, Unocal, Transworld, Phillips Petroleum, Diamond Shamrock, Lorimar Telepictures, Harris Graphics. According to Drexel executives, it was Fischbach that the government in depositions appeared to be focusing on the most. Indeed, in April 1987, when Boesky would take his criminal plea, having agreed to a consent decree regarding the SEC charges earlier, he would plead guilty to a criminal information that charged him with conspiring to make false statements to the SEC in the context of a conspiracy to gain control of Fischbach, an engineering company. The document charged that a conspirator had instructed Boesky to acquire Fischbach stock, and that Boesky was later reimbursed for losses as part of an attempt to reconcile other outstanding money differences. According to sources quoted by Stewart and Hertzberg, that conspirator was Milken, and that settling of differences was part of the $5.30 million payment. The Fischbach saga, which had been partially told, minus the alleged Milken-Boesky parking arrangement, by reporter Alan Sloan in the December 1985 Forbes, certainly looked like a classic Milken orchestration. It had begun back in 1983, when Victor Posner, then still a client in good standing at Drexel, and one of Milken's circle of high rollers, was being thwarted in his desire to gain control of Fischbach. Posner had entered into a standstill agreement with Fischbach in 1980 which prohibited his buying more than 24.9% of the company unless someone else acquired more than 10%. In December, 1983, Fred Carr of First Executive converted his Fischbach convertible bonds to stock, which gave him a 13.1% holding in the company. In January, 1984, Fischbach bought Carr out at the market price. In April, 1984, Posner sued Fischbach, claiming that Carr's holding had voided the standstill. Also in April, Boesky began acquiring Fischbach stock. By the summer, Boesky had acquired 13.4%. Posner, who now could argue that the standstill had been doubly voided, increased his stake in Fischbach to 28% and sought antitrust clearance to acquire more than 50%. Fischbach gave up the FI-GHT and agreed to give Posner control, once he had bought 51% of the company's shares. In February 1985, Drexel raised $48 million for Posner's Pennsylvania engineering. Also in February, Boesky sold all his Fischbach stock for $45 a share in London, when Fischbach was trading in the high 30s in New York. Boesky also sold Fischbach convertible debentures in the over-the-counter market at a premium over their face value. The same day, Pennsylvania Engineering purchased the identical number of shares, for $45 each, in the over-the-counter market, and the same amount of convertible debentures that Boesky had sold. The bulk of the $48 million Drexel raised for Pennsylvania Engineering was used to purchase these securities. Ultimately, Posner bought more than 50% of Fischbach stock. He became chairman of the company in October 1985. The Pennsylvania engineering underwriting occurred while Posner was struggling to raise money to take over National Can, and several months after Drexel executives said they had decided to raise no more money for Posner. One Drexel executive said, "It's true, we had made that decision. But the Pennsylvania engineering underwriting was for the Fischbach stock, and that whole thing had started before we made that decision, although it happened afterwards." It is true that Posner's Fischbach machinations predated the FI-RM's decision to raise no more funds for him, but that would in itself have been no reason for Milken and his investment banking colleagues to rescind their decision, unless they were already involved.
If the government is right in what it is alleging in the criminal information, of course, and assuming the conspirator is Milken, then they were.
According to the criminal information, and as agreed by Boesky in his guilty plea, Boesky was assured by the conspirators that he would be made whole on any losses resulting from his Fischbach stock purchases at the outset. Boesky also conference IRMED that the conspirators arranged for the purchase of the Boesky holdings at the above market price. Boesky took a loss on Fischbach, but it would have been much greater if he had not been able to sell to Posner at about 20% above market. With the Pennsylvania engineering underwriting, Posner got the money to acquire the company, and Milken got a way of cutting Boesky's losses, which he had allegedly guaranteed. Remember Milken's maneuverings, scouring the country for a buyer, finally settling on Peltz when no one else was willing, raising all the money for the acquisition, to rescue Posner from the trap he found himself in at National Can, and the government's Fischbach scenario becomes utterly credible. It is, in fact, vintage Milken. At the controls, fine-tuning here, adjusting there, advancing his players, using them to pressure some reluctant party, moving one to help another, fiercely intent, always, on expanding his scope, and maintaining the delicate equilibrium of the interconnected whole. Ironically, all the machinations were for no Professor I table end. The Pennsylvania engineering debt, raised at rates of 17% to 22%, coincided with a slump in that company's main business, making the interest payments crippling. Fischbach's construction business suffered at the same time, so that it was unable to help with those interest payments. Professor I table when Posner Phi RST targeted it, Fischbach's earnings were $26.70 million in 1983, its peak year. Fischbach lost $29 million in 1986. And by mid-1987 the downward spiral of Posner's empire had accelerated, accentuating the wisdom of Drexel's decision in the fall of '84 to do no more financings for him, a decision that Drexel executives must fervently wish they had adhered to. Sometimes, as seems to have been true in Fischbach, the actions performed by Milken's machine, in its diverse parts, were complex. Sometimes they were brutally simple. Milken's apparent use of Steinberg as a club to gain Wicks's business was an example of the latter. As was the attempted extortion that Staley Continental alleges took place in November 1987, just days before Boesky Day, when Milken's troops had no idea the end was near and so appeared to have been carrying on business as usual in the department. In February '87, Staley Phi led suit against Drexel, alleging that Drexel had made an extortionate attempt to force Staley to use it as an investment banker so that Staley could be taken over by a Drexel-Staley management leveraged buyout group. The suit was proceeding along its private, civil track, but Drexel executives said that it had obviously aroused government interest, as the SEC in its depositions was focusing intensively on Staley also. According to one former Drexel executive, Drexel had attempted to court the blue-chip food company Staley as a client in the early '80s, through a contact at Bruxelles Lambert, but had been rebuffed. The Drexel of the mid-'80s, however, was not so easily discouraged. The Staley suit alleges that Drexel and some of its customers began making purchases of Staley stock in late October '86. On November 3, it says, a representative of Drexel contacted Staley's chief financial officer, Robert Hoffman, and expressed an interest in establishing an investment banking relationship. 3 days later, the person in charge of accumulating Staley stock at Drexel, Milken's favored salesman trader James Dahl, also a central figure in the Beverly Hills savings and loan suit against Drexel, allegedly told Hoffman that Drexel had acquired approximately 1.5 million shares, more than 5% of the company's stock, and might buy more. Dahl is said to have advised Hoffman against Staley's doing a planned common stock offering. On November 11, the complaint continues, Dahl suggested a management-led leveraged buyout to Hoffman. He also warned against Staley's proceeding with its planned stock issue with any investment banker but Drexel. On November 13, Staley registered a 4 million share offering with the SEC, with Merrill Lynch and First Boston as lead managers. Dahl allegedly threatened to disrupt the offering, and over the next several days heavy selling forced Staley's stock price down $5. Drexel sold into our offering, Staley's general counsel, Robert Scott, told the Wall Street Journal. On November 21, Staley withdrew the offering and led with the SEC for a new issue of preferred stock. Additional costs associated with this revised deal were $70 million, for which Staley was suing Drexel, as compensatory damages. It was also suing for twice that in punitive damages. At least as provocative as what Drexel did, as alleged in the Staley complaint, is what Dahl said. He allegedly acknowledged that Drexel had not yet led a 13D. Despite the fact that he said the firm owned more than 5% of Staley's stock. 13Ds, he explained, were bad for business. In assuring Hoffman that Drexel was genuinely interested in pursuing a leveraged buyout of Staley with its management, Dahl allegedly explained that Drexel drew no distinction between debt and equity because companies' life cycles were so short, and that Drexel could take Staley private in 48 hours. In warning Hoffman against Staley's doing the common stock offering, Dahl allegedly said, "It is very important for us to sit down and talk before you do something that hurts me and before I do something that hurts you." The equity offering, Dahl allegedly made plain, would hurt Drexel by diluting the value of its holdings, and if that happened, the next thing that happens is someone files a 13D at $40 a share and management is thrown out. Later, after Staley had decided to go ahead with the offering, Dahl allegedly asked how its pricing would be handled and commented that he would hate to see Drexel have to sell into the offering. This was the Drexel, the brass knuckles, threatening, market-manipulating Cosa Nostra of the securities world, that its rival investment bankers and corporate targets loved to hate. Drexel was already down, 3 months into the government investigation, when the Staley suit was led, but a round of cheers went up in the investment banking community. Just as rivals had circulated copies of the Green Tree complaint when it had been led, so now, Drexel executives alleged, Solomon sent its clients copies of the Staley complaint. To many who knew Dahl, his alleged comments rang with authenticity. Seeming not only literally but symbolically true, they captured the zeitgeist of the Beverly Hills operation. While these acquaintances of Dahl speculated that he might have been off on an entrepreneurial spree, unauthorized by Milken, they agreed that it was the kind of action that the culture of the department encouraged. One former Drexel employee claimed, "What Jim Dahl is alleged to have said was not the exception in Beverly Hills, but the norm." Moreover, it seems unlikely that Milken, who was obsessed with controlling his people and everything that he touched, who in an SEC deposition several years earlier had spoken about his gradually developed ability to hear everything that went on his trading floor, would have utterly missed Dahl's machinations in Staley. As one former member of this group declared, Mike controlled everything. He was like Patton, up on the hill. He saw everything that went on, heard everything. Drexel took the position publicly that the suit was totally without merit. According to one Drexel employee, the FIREM's officials to whom Staley complained in November decided that Dahl had said some things that were inappropriate, and they hastened to reassure Staley that Drexel would do nothing to destabilize the company. Drexel and Staley were in the midst of executing a standstill agreement, this executive says, when Staley suddenly led suit. This executive also adds that Drexel was a net buyer, not seller, during the Staley aborted offering. Therefore, he states, Dahl was all talk and no action. Drexel did not ruin the stock offering, and there were no grounds for a suit. Even if Drexel did not carry out Dahl's alleged threats, the Staley situation exemplified, in this writer's view, conduct that was probably central to the Milken machine and that could be a 13D violation. Assembling control of more than 5% of the stock but not disclosing it publicly while using it as a threat privately. Milken was the great choreographer. He knew where convertible bonds were and where lots of stocks were, or he could advise clients to buy them and then he could bring their cumulative weight to bear, all without filing a 13D and disclosing that these shares were being used in concert to achieve his end. From his earliest days as a bond trader, when his fellow bondholders typically were a passive lot, Milken had understood that controlling a position of size in a company's securities, even its debt securities, meant a chance to exert control over that company. He had tried this with Rickless, in Rapid American, and been well received. He had tried this with Sigaloff, in Dalen, and not been. The Milken who years later reportedly told Sigaloff, in Wix, that, with the stock that others held but he controlled, he effectively had control of the company, was simply a Milken who had grown far more powerful, who could direct the movement of stocks owned by others, but it was the same Milken. In addition to looking for evidence of Drexel's having assembled blocks of stock without complying with disclosure requirements, and of its having parked stocks to disguise their true ownership, the government also appeared, during the first few months of '87, to be looking for evidence of the more garden variety misuse of inside information. Passing inside information about coming deals to favored customers was something for which the SEC had investigated Milken in earlier years, always fruitlessly. According to press reports, the government had subpoenaed both Rodrigo Rocha and Guy Dove, attempting to ascertain whether Atlantic Capital, on tips from Drexel, had invested in common stocks before announced tender offers. If true, this would have given Atlantic Capital added motivations, beyond the high yield of the bonds, for being probably the single largest subscriber to the junk bonds in the 1985 takeovers. It would have had a powerful interest in the deals going through, since it was a shareholder in the target company, and it would also be repaying the favors of Drexel's tips. As the investigation continued, the government would become interested in another satellite group with which Milken had done business, the Regan-Thorpe entities. James Regan and Edward Thorpe and their associates had been Milken's partners at least since the Treasury's stripping days of Dorchester Government Securities and Belvedere Securities, and they had been a focus of SEC interest in the 1985 investigation into the trading of Caesars World Securities. In December 1987, federal agents would raid and confiscate more than 60 boxes of documents and business records going back to January 1984 from 3 FIRMS which operated from the same address in Princeton, New Jersey. Princeton Newport Arbitrage Partners, Englewood Partners and the Oakley Sutton Management Corporation. According to search warrant filings, the government was hoping to establish that a network of traders had been involved in a scheme of stock parking. It also sought evidence of improper tax deductions taken on losses that were generated from hedging on trades involving convertible bonds and warrants, according to the court documents. Among those named in the warrant was Bruce Newberg, who had been a trader in convertibles for Milken and was still a member of Milken's group though no longer on the trading desk. In the early months of the investigation, however, it had not seemed plausible that it would continue for over a year without producing indictments. Nearly every Friday in March and April of 1986, Wall Street gossip had predicted that the Milken and Drexel indictments would be announced at the market's close, gossip fueled, of course, by press reports which purported to spell out the government's impending case against Drexel in great detail. While those reports were not borne out within the 6 months following Boesky Day, other events had occurred. Boesky, to the surprise of few on the street, had offered up Martin Siegel. On February 13, Siegel had pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts of tax evasion and conspiracy to violate securities laws, and also agreed to pay $9 million in civil fines. The insider trading with Boesky to which he pleaded, however, had occurred while he was at Kidder, before he went to Drexel. Siegel, in turn, had offered up Robert Freeman, head of the arbitrage department at the impeccable Goldman Sachs. Richard Wigton, head of arbitrage at Kidder, Peabody, and Timothy Tabor, former head of arbitrage at Merrill Lynch. These 3 men were arrested the day before Siegel took his plea, and they were charged with being part of an information-swapping conspiracy. But, by May their indictments had been dropped. On March 20, Boyd Jefferies, chairman of Jefferies Group, the Los Angeles-based brokerage firm that had become a major force in takeovers, pleaded to 2 felony counts of securities law violations, and settled related charges with the SEC relating to market manipulation and to parking stock in a scheme with Boesky. By April 1, the opening day of the 1987 Predators Ball, it seemed to many Drexel employees and their clients that the government's drumbeat was almost deafening. Freeman, Wigton and Tabor had been arrested without warning. Wigton led from his Kidder off ICE in handcuffs, and the nightmare of some at Drexel was of Milken being arrested on stage at the Predators Ball. The conference drew a record crowd, some probably out of curiosity but many out of loyalty. Fred Joseph appeared ill and suddenly aged. Other Drexel executives were depressed and fatigued. Carrie Maltish looked especially haggard. Maltish was the Drexel off ICL, formerly in Beverly Hills but now based in New York, who according to sources quoted by Stewart and Hertzberg handled all Milken's personal trading and, at the end of each day, destroyed computer printouts of his trades in a shredder. The mood at the Polo Lounge, where for the Phi RST time Engel's girls were absent, was wake-like. It's because of the First Amendment, one Drexel executive explained sourly, referring to press reports. Milken alone looked well. He did not introduce as many of the client presentations as he had done in years past, having accepted the view of Joseph and others that for the good of the firm he should recede somewhat at this conference lest he soon have to recede forever. But when he mounted the stage at the Beverly Hilton during the closing gala, his loyalists, over 2,000 strong, gave him an ovation that seemed as if it would never end. 16. The center cannot hold. In the 6 months that followed Boesky Day, Drexel was a reminder of the old adage that the higher they rise, the harder they fall. The heights that Drexel's executives had scaled had been so dizzying, and their descent was now so sudden, that some felt themselves on a roller coaster. Many at Drexel looked for the root of their downfall outside. The press, mainly the Wall Street Journal, which, shortly after Boesky Day, had begun to describe in increasingly greater detail Milken, Drexel, and Milken's takeover machine as targets of the investigation, was one scapegoat. The government, as personified chief ly in the SEC and the U.S. Attorney's Office ICE, one or both of which was presumed to be leaking to the press, and secondarily in a newly aroused Congress, was another. America's corporate elite, those business roundtable types who had fought the hated Drexel and their Araviste clients on every possible front, in Congress, in court, at the Fed, and lost, but who now saw a chance to reverse that rout, was a third. And Drexel's investment banking rivals on the street, who had marshaled much of corporate America's attack on the upstart firm but in the end had decided to play its game, were yet a fourth. The more conspiracy-minded at Drexel saw combinations of the four, in unholy league. The distortions and even falsehoods being uttered about our firm and some of its personnel are so rampant and willful that one wonders if it isn't a plot to destroy us, wrote Tubby Burnham, the then 77-year-old honorary chairman of the board, in an anguished letter to Drexel Burnham employees 10 days after Boesky Day. Arthur Bilger, corporate finance partner in Beverly Hills, spoke for many of his colleagues when he pointed out that, between 20 and 25% of Fortune 500 companies disappeared in 1986. I am convinced that it is that, generally, plus our having gone after the major oil companies, Gulf, Phillips and Unocal, that has caused our troubles. Others at Drexel saw the backlash springing from a resentment more deep-rooted and age-old. Now they harked back to the fears expressed by many Jewish members of the business establishment ever since Drexel had FIRST conjured up its armies of takeover entrepreneurs. Paul Levy, one of Drexel's 3.9 unregistered exchange offer specialists, put it bluntly. There is a lot of anti-Semitism at work, Levy declared. People see Drexel as a bunch of Jewish guys who have been making too much money. Amidst all the talk of persecution, however, there was a certain amount of self-examination and recrimination. What the aftermath of Boesky Day made crystal clear was that Drexel had no friend on the street. In the early 80s, as its junk business flourished, the firm had been disdained by Wall Street's titans. Not hated, but disdained. Once Drexel had become a titan itself, it had seemed to take pleasure in remaining the outsider, in fluid outing the rules of the fraternity, in crushing that fraternity's members when it could. Other FIRMS syndicated deals, in common stock and investment-grade bond issues, not only to share the risk but to spread the goods about the street in a collegial fashion. Milken hated syndicated deals. He hated having a co-manager. He would not spread the goods, and they could keep their fraternity. Now was the comeuppance. Howard Brenner, a member of Drexel's executive committee who had been at the firm since it was Burnham and Company, admitted, "Some of our colleagues, at Drexel, especially the younger ones, were very arrogant, and it's come home to bite us." To me, the investigation is a parable, declared another Drexel executive. It has brought us down for our hubris, in our not paying sufficient attention to our transactions, in our dealings with other people. Things like sending people to another city for a roadshow. Not giving any bonds to a co-manager. Taking a piece of business from another firm which had already filed a prospectus. Other people have occasionally done this kind of thing to us, but I have a hunch that we started it. So far, the government doesn't seem to have evidence of anything illegal. But we are already so weakened, by the press reports of the investigation. It is as though we are paying the penalty for our other sins. In the months after Boesky Day, it seemed plain that even if Drexel and Milken were to survive, their idyll, in which Milken could raise billions in a matter of days for a hostile bid, in which no company in America was safe from him, would be ended. It was a time for epitaphs. I think the systematic realigning of corporate America, and putting parts of companies in the hands of guys who have major equity stakes in those companies, is the best thing we have done for our society, commented corporate finance partner Stephen Weinroth. The cat's out of the bag, and if the old guard establishment puts us out of business, they're not going to put the concept out of business, be it the LBO or the hostile takeover or valuing a company and breaking it up because the assets are worth more broken up than whole. Weinroth lapsed into the familiar refrain, articulated by Milken, Icahn and others of their persuasion, about the decline of corporate America in the hands of its managers, and its rescue by the new breed of manager-owners. Old companies were started by true entrepreneurs, who had children some of whom were affected by the ills of the rich, he continued. They brought in professional managers, who ran the companies in a conservative fashion. But those professional managers didn't have an ownership stake. Their risk-reward ratio was skewed to being a conservator, not an initiator. Then the second generation, managers, grew to the top. And even if they were high quality as managers, they were certainly not entrepreneurial. And then that group promoted people who couldn't threaten them, and they in turn hired people inferior to them, who lived for their perks and compensation and ran their companies conservatively because they had no upside interest. And by the time you go through several generations of these managers, you have a company run by dull normals. It started to change in the FTIES, he said. As new businesses sprang up largely out of a new spurt of technological innovation, there were some entrepreneurial guys. More recently, all the LBO guys have said, "We want the managers to have a stake in this business, because we want them to get rich if they do well." Typically, 5 to 20% of a deal would be owned by management. "I think the principles are right," Weinroth concluded, "and the fact that some of our players are venal or self-interested or unpleasant is almost beside the point. There is a greater machine going, and if these guys don't make a go of it, then somebody else will buy the stock, and the ownership will reside very close to the helm." And Drexel had more to do with it than anyone else. The months after the November Boesky Day were rife with signs of Drexel's ebbing power. The FIRST and most symbolic was Drexel's decision, announced in early December, to abandon its much-heralded move to the 47-story tower, 7 World Trade Center, which it had agreed to lease in its entirety in June, '86. Just as the announcement of the impending move to that imposing building had been a dramatic statement that Drexel was assuming its place among the established giants of Wall Street, so its cancellation suggested that that ascension was no more. The most mammoth publicly announced deals that Drexel had been backing when the Boesky news hit, Icon's bid for USX, Perelman's for Gillette and Sigaloff's, Wix's, just announced acquisition of Lear Siegler, came to a total of roughly $14 billion. For Icon, Perelman and Sigaloff, these deals would have represented an enormous expansion of their respective empires. In addition to collecting a king's ransom and financing fees in these deals, in USX, for example, Drexel's fee would have been roughly $250 million. Drexel would have reaped a golden harvest of divestiture business. But after Boesky Day, despite Drexel's assertions that it could still place the debt for these deals, those financings were deemed sufficiently questionable that the bidders' hands were weakened. Ultimately, all 3 deals foundered. Wix abandoned its acquisition of Lear Siegler, and Perelman and Icon were beaten back from their targets. In the next 6 months, the whole of the FIRST half of 1987, Drexel did not back a single hostile bid. Other hallmarks of the Milken regime also disappeared, casualties of this new epoch in which Milken and Drexel would be forced to live under the government's microscope. Privately placed, unregistered bonds, for example, no longer changed hands en masse, moving from Milken's high rollers to the second-tier buyers in that FLO that was so integral to the Milken machine. Mark Schenkman of Schenkman Capital commented about 2 months after Boesky Day, "Privates still trade. But now precise logs are kept, and they, Milken's salesmen and traders, can only talk to 25 people about it. It can't be a public distribution. They are reining Mike in." And at least some of the gold mine investment partnerships, through which Milken had built wealth FIRST for his own people and then for a wider group in corporate finance, were closed down. The major partnership with corporate finance, which invested in buyouts, was named Concordia. In 1985, Concordia's return had been close to 100%. By the end of 1986, when it was closed out, it was FLAT for the year. This was strange, since 1986 had been a soaringly Professor I table year at Drexel. That had to have been done on purpose, insisted one former Drexel employee, so that they could say, "See? We always knew that with the kind of risk we take we'd hit a bad year sooner or later." Within days of the Boesky plea, rival investment bankers had begun going down the list of Drexel clients, soliciting their business. While Drexel's traditional stable appeared still loyal, the blue-chip clients that Drexel had been struggling to win, whether by courtship or by coercion, whether by Martin Siegel or by Jim Dahl, quickly fell away. Theirs had been an uneasy alliance with Milken. In the months just prior to Boesky Day, Goodyear had brought Drexel in along with Goldman Sachs to advise it on a defensive restructuring. Viacom had hired Drexel along with Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette to assist in its management buyout. Ralston Purina had added Drexel as a third co-manager, along with Goldman, Sachs and Solomon, for an investment-grade bond issue. According to well-placed sources in each of these deals, Drexel was brought in for only one reason: so that it would not bring in a competing bidder or finance a raid on the company. The uneasiness, moreover, had existed not only on the part of these corporate clients, but within Drexel. Such client representations were integral to Joseph's and Siegel's shared vision of institution building, were in fact the mission with which Siegel had come to Drexel. But they were at odds with the gospel according to Milken, a gospel which taught that these corporate behemoths deserved to be taken over because they were being run inefficiently, so it was not only Professor Itable to do so, but right. In the above instances, however, Milken had apparently acceded to Joseph and agreed to allow his piece to be bought. Now Milken's hands had been involuntarily tied. And the corporate establishment, no longer afraid, was no longer interested. Lear Siegler, for example, had followed Siegel from Kidder to Drexel. In its sale to Wicks, Drexel had been its investment banker. But about a week after Boesky Day, when that sale fell through, Lear Siegler brought in Goldman Sachs to study the alternatives of a leveraged buyout or a corporate recapitalization. With the Fortune 500 companies, it was all fear, remarked one former Drexel employee. In the summer and fall of '86, I would make a call to a CEO and the call would be returned in a half hour. Once Drexel started to fall, they never returned my calls. Now Drexel, which had used fear to wedge its way into corporate suites, was riddled with fear itself, fear of what the government might find. Fear of losing business. Fear of seeing the value of the Phi-RM stock, widely held among about 2,050 employees, and its capital decimated, in the event the Phi-RM had to pay crippling damages as a result of the investigation. Fear of the damage to recruitment. And, because of all this, fear of a mass exodus of employees, draining the Phi-RM not only of talent but of capital as they demanded payout on their stock. In the Phi-RST few months, about a half-dozen associates in corporate finance and M&A did leave Drexel. This was followed by a major defection in April, when an entire group of 7 professionals, including one senior-level executive, all of whom had been hired from Kidder within the past year, departed for Payne Weber. So fearful was Fred Joseph of an exodus, according to one Drexel employee, that in December '86 he broached the idea of soliciting signed loyalty pledges from all senior employees, promising that they would not leave the Phi-RM for at least 1 year. Executives reportedly tried to dissuade him, arguing that it was distasteful, a sign of weakness on the Phi-RM's part, and in any case unenforceable. Finally, Joseph abandoned the idea. For Joseph, who had had false starts in the business, who had dreamed back in the '70s of building an institution as important as Goldman Sachs, and who had felt he was tantalizingly close to that goal, it must have been an agony to see it slip through his fingers. While Milken remained protectively cloistered as always, Joseph, the frontman, had to step into the glare of the public spotlight. Looking gray and puffy-eyed, photogenic no longer, he was shown, incredibly enough, sitting on the FL or in his off-ICE on the cover of a December, '86 issue of Fortune magazine, where the subtitle described him as "floored by the crisis." The ready and conference ident, albeit superficial, answers he had always produced were now replaced by ones so tentative and unsure that they invited parody among some of his partners, such as his quote in Businessweek, dated December 22. "What I think I'm conference ident of is that we don't know of anyone here who's done anything wrong." It was Joseph's personal crucible. He had assumed the post of CEO, from Robert Linton, who retained the title of chairman, but had clearly yielded the leadership of the firm to Joseph, only about 18 months before Boesky Day. Back in the early 70s, Joseph had become chief operating officer of Shearson, Hamel, which, 6 months later, had to merge into Shearson Hayden Stone, through no fault of his. One Drexel executive recalled ruefully that at a meeting immediately after Joseph had assumed the top post at Drexel, John Sort, who had been with Joseph at Shearson, quipped, "Fred, how many months do you give us before we fail, with you as chief executive?" Joseph, more than anyone else, had been the architect of the institutional expansion of Drexel. For Milken the firm was a vehicle, but for Joseph it was an end in itself. And Joseph possessed certain traits which had, in his lexicon, added value to the firm. First, he was a super salesman, a great compliment to Milken on the corporate finance side, especially in the early days before Milken started doing everything himself. Second, he had a frontman personality that was so good it made you forget that that was what it was. Down to earth, good-humored, redolent with boyish charm, but all bright surface, with a veneer that never cracked. And, third, he had that overriding desire to win, which was probably the key to his and Milken's compatibility. His paramount contribution, however, was in a role that was much like that of a manager of a great Hollywood star. Joseph had managed Milken. Fred grabbed onto those, Milken's, coattails, directed them some, orchestrated them a lot to the public and to us, commented one Drexel executive. Now the firm's shining star had become its greatest liability, and it was not so clear that Joseph's dominant traits were what this crisis required. In a time of terrible uncertainty, when the firm was being publicly tarred with the suggestion that its key employees had committed crimes, its ideal leader would be decisive, strong and principled, the personification of integrity. There were at least two views of Joseph within the firm. One was that while he came closer to monitoring Milken than anyone else, he still was kept in the dark about some things that transpired on the West Coast. Somewhat short of information, therefore, he was nonetheless seen as an honest, restraining force. Former corporate finance partner Julian Schroeder claimed, "Mike would do anything. I would have felt naked there without Fred." Schroeder added that on a visit to Drexel in the spring of '86 he had found Joseph in the midst of one of his many daily phone conversations with Milken, in which Joseph was saying, "Michael, you are the only one who can put yourself in jail. Now, don't do it." To Schroeder, this remark indicated that things had not changed since he left the firm in 1984. Joseph was still struggling to control Milken. Another view, however, was that Joseph and Milken, consumed by a similar, religious fire to win, were more in league than in counterpoint. And that Joseph, therefore, was more pragmatic than principled. As one Drexel employee maintained, "Fred is great in an up market." In an up market, the leadership, the salesmanship, the upbeatness are the important things. But all the quick moves that in good times looked like a great salesman, in bad times looked dishonest. And when things are bad, he can't make a decision. Joseph, this employee said, is the consummate rationalizer about why somebody doesn't have to get fired. There was a case to be made that the firm should have either fired or suspended Martin Siegel in December, after he had been subpoenaed in the grand jury investigation, and it seemed all of Wall Street was convinced that the Boesky-Siegel game was finally exposed. Siegel remained at the firm until his plea was announced in February. Indeed, even the hiring of Siegel in early '86 arguably attests to Joseph's being long on pragmatism and short on principle, since Siegel was so widely rumored on the street to be involved in insider trading with Boesky. A stronger case could be made for the firing of Jim Dahl, if Joseph believed that Dahl had in fact said what Staley alleged. And this was not the FIRST complaint about Dahl. Beverly Hills Savings and Loan, in its lawsuit against Drexel and Dahl, had accused him of fraudulent misrepresentation. The same employee declared, "Dahl was a loose cannon. He has put securities in people's accounts without calling them. We knew what he was, but Mike liked him, because he was productive." The Staley threats might not be illegal, but there should be a standard of conduct. But Fred's attitude when it came to firing Siegel or Dahl was, if we get rid of them, they will hurt us. Joseph, of course, would not have been the FIRST chief executive to keep employees on so as not to create witnesses friendly to the government, with an investigation in progress. His lawyers might well have advised him not to fire the two. But a less defensible example of Joseph's elevation of pragmatism over principle was his decision, also urged by Milken, to bring Donald Engel back into the firm. Engel had been a FIXTURE at the firm since the days of Burnham and Company. As Victor Posner became a more important Drexel client in the late 70s and early 80s, Engel had handled his account on the corporate finance side and become a director on several of the Posner-controlled companies' boards. According to many of his colleagues, Engel knew little about corporate finance, particularly in the sophisticated way that Drexel practiced it by the '80s, but he did have a way with clients. And, since the earliest days of the Predators Ball, he had been extremely useful to Milken on the social side, a perpetual gladhander, a happy panderer. Mike always respected Don's usefulness, declared one former member of the Milken Group. Don could make sure the clients got laid, and Mike didn't have to dirty himself. But in 1984 Engel was forced to resign. According to one Drexel executive, Engel had taken money from a Drexel client that should have been paid to the firm. Engel denies this charge. Some executives wanted to sever all ties with Engel, but Milken reportedly argued in his behalf, and in the end Engel became a consultant, negotiating a lucrative fee arrangement for any business he originated. Ironically enough, it was as a consultant that Engel saw his wealth accumulate. The clients with whom he had relationships, among them Peltz and Perelman, were Drexel kingpins by 1985. One Drexel employee said that Engel's compensation for 1986, probably including warrants, was about $9 million. And while Engel had had to relinquish his ICE at Drexel when he was forced to resign, his new business habitat was the third floor of his friend Perelman's townhouse. He still presented himself as a member of the firm. To reach Engel's ICE one called the Drexel switchboard. It was, then, the cushiest of exiles. But in January '87, when Drexel's push for new clients had ground to a halt, and the firm seemed to be in danger of losing much if not all of the territory it had appropriated over the past decade, Engel was deemed too valuable to not be a full full-fledged member of the team. Soliciting new clients was the business of the Investment Banking Group, IBG, formed in early 1986 and headed by corporate finance partner Chris Anderson. Even before the trauma triggered by Boesky Day, however, the IBG had been a failure, and by late 1987 the group would be disbanded. Anderson, who has a rambling, free associating habit of mind, was considered by his colleagues to be a creative investment banker but a poor administrator and ill-suited for this management post. Moreover, Anderson's attention to the IBG was sporadic, inasmuch as he and Stephen Weinroth in May of '86 had bought a 13% stake in Centronics Data Computer Corporation, a Drexel investment banking client. Though he and Weinroth had done this with Joseph's permission, their move had caused bad blood among many of their colleagues, particularly when Weinroth, Centronics' new chairman, discussed its becoming a deal-making vehicle whose deals might be in competition with some Drexel clients. Some at Drexel maintained that the real problem of the IBG lay in the FI-RM's generally freewheeling, unstructured approach, exemplified in part by the Centronics situation. The Drexel culture encouraged entrepreneurism at every turn. Compliance, capital allocation, exposure and accounting were centralized, but all other decisions were left to the head of each group, so that the FI-RM was run as a loosely connected association of free enterprises. Drexel was made up of little fiefdoms, with no rules, recalled one former IBG member. Joseph wanted it to be that way. It was supposed to be more entrepreneurial, and I guess it had worked for a while, especially when the place was smaller, but it didn't anymore. You'd, as a member of the IBG, call on a company and find out that 4 weeks before, someone from corporate finance had been there. 3 weeks before, someone from M&A, and 2 weeks before, one of Mike's guys. No one had any idea what anyone else was doing. It was chaos. Now, in January '87, Engel was brought back to the FI-RM to be co-head, with Anderson, of the IBG. Engel invited one of the IBG members, a recent recruit from a premier Wall Street FI-RM, to break fast. He reportedly told this associate that he, Engel, was his new boss, not Anderson, and that he would be dealing directly with Milken. Symbolic of his stewardship, Engel had rechristened the IBG the Relationship Group. He is said to have explained that it was emphasizing relationships that would win the new clients, that was the style of business at which he excelled, and that the way to establish relationships was by getting in the minds of prospective clients and providing them what they wanted. This associate had heard Engel's analysis before. At the Tokyo Bond Conference, when he had FI-RST met Engel, Engel had allegedly remarked to him, "I understand CEOs. CEOs don't care about money, power or fame. They have all that. What they want is pussy. And I'm going to make sure they get it." Then, however, Engel had been only a consultant to the FI-RM. Now he was this young investment banker's boss, ready to school the IBG in his kind of business getting. One Drexel executive recalled, he, the associate, said, "Amigod, everything they told me about Drexel over at. It was all true. The place is a total slime bucket." He immediately resigned from Drexel and returned to his former FI-RM. At Drexel, the melodrama continued. Word had circulated about what had precipitated the associate's resignation. Younger employees at the FI-RM did not know why Engel had been forced to resign in 1984. Many, knowing Engel as a notorious, compulsive womanizer, believed it had been for the kind of incident that had just occurred. But whatever the reason had been, it was clear to these fresh-faced Harvard MBAs, who had had their pick of the FI-RMs on Wall Street and had chosen Drexel, that Engel, like his longtime client Victor Posner, was an unsavory reminder of the old Drexel, which would be better forgotten. If there was ever a time for the FI-RM to cultivate a straight arrow image, they thought, surely this was it. Anderson and Weinroth, who both had opposed Engel's reinstatement, now threatened to resign unless he was forced to resign again. And within 2 weeks, by early February, there was such a popular groundswell against Engel that people were calling it a revolution. When Engel tried to enter an IBG meeting on February 6, Anderson ordered him out. Engel left the room and called John Kissick in Beverly Hills, who was participating in the meeting via a hookup. Engel's strongest support had always come from the coast. Kissick said he thought it was okay for Engel to attend. As soon as the meeting broke, Anderson walked across the street to Drexel's executive off ICES to deliver his resignation to Joseph. Weinroth said he would resign, too. Another corporate finance partner, Alan Brumberger, calling in from out of town, said he would join them. Joseph, who in earlier, more upbeat times had described himself as the Dr. Feelgood of Drexel, reportedly asked for 1 week to try to resolve the problem in a way that would make everyone happy. That, however, was not possible, and Engel was forced to resign. He resumed his consultant status. Engel's reinstatement had lasted less than a month. It is true that in the larger scheme of Drexel's troubles it was only a sideshow. But at a time when Drexel employees were already shell-shocked, depressed, embarrassed, defensive and fearful for their futures, it managed to make morale even worse, holding up a mirror to the firm and reflecting an unsightly image. That image had nothing to do with what the government was investigating, and yet it had everything to do with it. Engel's procurement of women for clients was not conduct the government would likely seek to prosecute, but its significance lay in the larger truth that it revealed about Drexel. For whether it meant procuring women, or threatening would-be clients, the resounding credo at Drexel was to do whatever it took to win. Everything bowed before that credo. Morality and legality became mere conventions, accepted modes of conduct for the foot soldiers of the world, the less creative, less aggressive, less visionary. The iconoclastic Milken, in whose image the firm had been formed, had always disdained conventional ways of seeing, conventional ways of doing business. And, thanks to his fluid outing of convention, Drexel had apotheosized out of nothingness. It was that credo that had led to Engel's reinstatement. Joseph is said to have personally abhorred Engel. He may have also personally abhorred Engel's function, though he must have known and accepted it for years. He had made a show of enormous though disingenuous indignation to Institutional Investor in an interview for its August 1986 Milken Professor Isla, when the subject of hookers at the Chasen's dinner and Bungalow 8 was raised. Telling Institutional Investor that he went bananas when he heard the stories, Joseph added, "I discussed it with Michael and I said, if there ever is a hooker there, I'll fire everybody in sight, I'll kill everybody." And everyone said, "Fred, it's not true, you're overreacting, you're nuts." I said, "All right, but not one woman who would embarrass us if someone knew exactly what she did for a living. And I think I can guarantee you that there isn't a single woman there who doesn't have a legitimate reason to be there and that none of them are hookers." It may well be that had history allowed Joseph to pursue his longtime vision of building an institution comparable to Goldman Sachs, he ultimately would have done away with Engel and his cast of, in case anyone asked, aspiring actresses and would-be models. But when the firm began to disintegrate around him, Joseph applied Drexel's one abiding test to the question of whether to bring Engel back. He thought, said one employee, with a shrug, that Donnie would be good for business. That quintessentially pragmatic credo, whatever it takes to win, may have shaped Drexel's response to the investigation, as well. In the first month or two after Boesky Day, the firm was in turmoil, apparently without a FIXED defensive strategy, taking the crisis day by day. There was a considerable amount of anxiety about who might be cooperating with the government. Some days, corporate finance executives in New York considered casting the West Coast adrift, telling the government that they had known things were not right out there, but never been sure of the specifics, so had not gone to the authorities, and that they wanted now to make their separate peace. But ultimately this notion had been vetoed as too ignoble. too disloyal to the regent who had made them all richer than they would ever have been without him, and also impractical, since it would have been difficult for the firm to escape liability. Instead, Drexel would present a united front and, unless the government came up with a smoking gun, fight back. Apparently, the closest thing to a smoking gun that the government had was that $5.30 million payment made from Boesky to Drexel in Beverly Hills. And after Boesky's auditors had demanded some documentation, Lowell Milken and Donald Balser had signed the invoice stating the payment was a fee for consulting and advisory services. In an article in the New York Times in February by James Sterngold, several Drexel executives were quoted, elaborating on this, saying that the payment was for several takeover bids, for the Financial Corporation of Santa Barbara, Scott and Fetzer, and U.S. News and World Report magazine, among others, that Boesky had asked them to work on but had never consummated. One Drexel official added that in some instances Boesky had backed out at the last minute, and that part of the $5.30 million was meant as compensation to Drexel for its work on these deals. After-the-fact explanations, however, accompanied by no corroborating documentation, tend to fall rather flat, particularly when set alongside the paper trail of records kept by Boesky which corroborated his version and which the government was said to have collected, according to sources quoted by Stewart and Hertzberg in the Wall Street Journal. One Drexel employee claimed that this problem, the lack of a paper trail for their side, had been solved by Drexel's fabricating one. Interviewed in early April, '87, this employee claimed that the books were cooked in the previous month or so, to show at least one specific charge to Boesky that had never existed, as part of that $5.30 million. About $1 million for research, related to Boesky's abortive takeover bids. If true, this was not only a desperate but an ill-considered gambit, since it appeared somewhat implausible on its face. While Drexel's research has become well regarded in the last couple of years, it was considerably less strong back in 1984, when the work on these bids would have occurred. It is especially unlikely that Boesky, who prided himself on his research capabilities in his own shop, would have paid for Drexel's. Moreover, when Boesky did utilize research from Wall Street firms, he was often given it gratis, in exchange for the commission dollars that the firms earned from his trading. A Drexel spokesman has stated that contemporaneously with the billing of the $5.30 million fee in March 1986, an internal memorandum directed that the fee be allocated among the corporate finance, research and high-yield bond departments, and there have been no subsequent changes. 17. The humbling. 1 year after Boesky Day, Drexel was still in limbo. Its likely indictment spelled out in great detail in the press many months before but not yet issued by any grand jury. In the world at large, however, events had not stood still. On October 19, 1987, the stock market's horrific crash was thought at the time to signal the end of an era in which a 5-year surging bull market whipped Wall Street into a frenzy of deal-making, an era in which financial fantasy routinely came true. In the wake of the crash, debt and leverage, which had seemed to possess magical properties for the conjuring of enormous wealth in the corporate arena, were demystified, seen as tools of excess which might now, in the harsh light of day and a possible recession, exact their toll. The spell, for the moment at least, was broken. Milken had not created the M&A binge of the '80s. Indeed, he had been an outsider, relegated to the sidelines until he and his colleagues provided their chosen with war chests and refined the concept of the Air Fund, conceived of in a go-by seminar but never implemented, into the highly conference ident letter. But once Milken won entry to the game, he did more to shape it than any other individual. It seemed only appropriate, in a sense, that this era might draw to a close now that its impresario was so hamstrung, though by early 1988 M&A would again be thriving and Milken would not yet be enjoined from the scene. For the past several years, while Drexel and its rivals were underwriting billions of dollars of junk bonds to finance scores of superleveraged acquisitions, critics had predicted that this mountainous debts test, and failure, would come in the next recession. They pointed out that in the early 80s recession the megadeals junk bonds had not yet existed, and that credit quality of junk had been deteriorating in the last couple of years. Therefore, they maintained, there had been no test of the junk market in its current, $150 billion form. In the October 1987 crash, junk bonds did fall in price, with the average junk portfolio losing at worst about 10% of its value. This was not surprising, since they are really part debt, part equity, and their value tends to fluctuate with the equity markets as much as or more than with the bond markets, their key variable being less the direction of interest rates than the perceived ability of the issuer to service its debt. While investors fled to Treasury bonds, which staged a huge rally as the stock market plunged, junk bonds yielded a near-record 5.5 percentage points over Treasury bonds with comparable maturities. In the weeks after the crash, the market for new junk issues was scarce, even at interest rates of 17 to 18%. And a scattering of obituaries for junk began to appear in the press. But they were wrong. For by mid-November, 1 month after the crash, the prices of the stronger junk issues had rebounded dramatically, while the weaker issues, among them credits which were dependent on asset sales to meet their debt obligations, for example, did not. At this point, it was a winnowing out of the junk market, not its demise. Moreover, the issues and deals that got so badly pounded by the crash that they overnight became symbols of the changed world in junk were by and large not Drexel's. Fruhoff bonds, for example, underwritten by Merrill Lynch, were at 82 to 84 just before the crash, and 2 weeks later were at 60 to 70. Also, in the wake of the crash, the Thompson family's management buyout of Southland Corporation was temporarily stalled, mid-deal, when its $1.50 billion of junk bonds could not be sold, even at rates of 18%. The investment banks at risk in Southland, at risk because they had been the lead lenders in a $600 million bridge loan extended to Southland the previous August, and now it was not at all clear that the bridge loan could be paid down, were Solomon and Goldman Sachs. About 2 months later, however, the Southland deal was restructured to offer investors an added sweetener of warrants, and it proceeded. After the crash, too, bridge loans suddenly lost their panache. They were now seen for what they had always been, serious risks to the investment banks which had extended them. Drexel had extended some, but had been far charier than most of the other major FI-RMS. Milken rejected the critics' premise that the market had not been tested. Critics, he said in a late November interview with this reporter, were using the wrong benchmark, because they lacked historical perspective. While it was true that broad public issuance of non-investment grade securities had started in 1977, he repeatedly emphasized that there had been a large high-yielding market, comprised mainly of fallen angels and paper issued in exchange offers, by 1960. And this market, he asserted, had been tested in 1970–71, and even more severely in both 1974–75 and 1980–81. The success of high-yield investments during these 3 periods was testimony to the diversity and underlying strength of high-yield companies themselves, Milken added. We were there to help provide advice and liquidity to both companies and investors during those periods, and we will be again, he declared. In reflecting upon it, the greatest opportunity to help, strengthen and build as during diff-I cult economic times. By late 87, those diff-I cult times had not yet impacted the rest of the country, but they had hit Wall Street. The retrenchment had started earlier in the year, after several major FI-RMS suffered severe trading losses because of interest rate volatility, but after the crash it proceeded with a vengeance. E.F. Hutton was purchased by Shearson Lehman Brothers. Some specialist FI-RMS were bought by Drexel, Merrill Lynch, Bear, Stearns, and others. Layoffs, bonus cutting, and reduction of overhead expenses were pandemic. Drexel was no exception, though its cuts were less dramatic than some FI-RMs. 100 of its 11,000 employees were laid off, and its bonuses were reduced, less so for star performers. Corporate America, witnessing Wall Street's distress, might have felt a certain mean-spirited gratify-cation. For while hundreds of public companies had undergone paroxysms of restructuring, overhead cutting, layoffs and elimination of research and development in order to escape an acquirer's clutches, Wall Street, insider of and handmaiden to all this frantic activity, had only grown fatter. But it could not last. Most of the Wall Street FI-RMS, after all, had relinquished their private partnership status over the last decade and become public companies themselves. Now the scythe had turned in their direction. Solomon, its earnings down and management poor, had become quarry for Ronald Perelman in August 1987. Solomon had managed to fend him off by selling a substantial stake to Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. The event served not only as an indicator of Wall Street's vulnerability but also as a reminder of how quickly this world had changed. Exactly 2 years earlier, the bid for Revlon by the unknown Perelman had seemed, almost, amusing. Now Perelman was a corporate titan to be reckoned with. Barring an apocalypse, the chain reaction collapse of dozens of junk bond financed, highly leveraged companies, which would then impact the junk portfolios of insurance companies, thrifts, pension funds, mutual funds and others, it will be 10 years before Milken's legacy becomes clear. Takeovers, buyouts and restructurings would have occurred if there had been no Michael Milken, but it is hard to imagine that they would have occurred in the size and volume that they did. And it will take time to discern whether, on balance, those financial maneuvers created leaner, stronger companies, by imposing the discipline of debt, by dismantling inefficient giants and putting their parts into the hands of managers who owned a piece and so did a better job, or whether they created undernourished, non-productive, non-competitive companies, crippled by the debt which in many instances had served only to enrich the short-term investors, and, of course, their investment bankers. In all likelihood, both scenarios had occurred, and the question would be which was demonstrably more prevalent. This, of course, was the debate that had raged through the mid-80s. In the speeches Milken gave in 1986, when he was at the zenith of his power, he had risen to it eagerly. Peltz and Perelman, Beatrice and Metromedia, had been his glowing success stories. But by late 1987 the companies that Milken and others at Drexel were pointing to with pride were Comdisco, the computer company, Hovnanian, the successful home builder, Kinder Care, the provider of daycare, although by late 1987, contrary to Drexel's depiction, the firm was moving into the financial services area and becoming a buyer of junk bonds. These were all companies which over the last decade had issued junk bonds and used the capital to grow, but not through acquisition, not by doing buyouts. It was as though Milken had entered a time warp, as though he were back in the late 70s and early 80s, raising junk bonds for small and medium-sized companies that needed capital and couldn't get it anywhere else. As though the last several years of his raising hundreds of millions for the high-rolling entrepreneurs who barely knew what to do with such sums, until he told them, of raising billions of dollars for the biggest, most leveraged acquisitions ever done in the history of this country, had not happened. The ultimate goal of the massive public relations campaign Drexel would mount in ads in newspapers and magazines throughout 1987 was to obliterate Drexel's M&A spectacular of 1985–86, to purge the public memory of Drexel's leading role. In the first few months of 1987, the campaign was more defensive and less focused. Drexel ran one centerfold in the Wall Street Journal listing, all in identical tiny print, with no titles, the names of its 10,000 employees, as though to emphasize that there were thousands of other people at Drexel in addition to the ones whose names were appearing regularly in the journal's articles on the government investigation. And in an effort to counter persistent rumors on the street that it was losing business, Drexel ran ads that listed hundreds of its faithful clients. But by the spring of 1987, the campaign developed a stronger message, that junk bonds, after years of hating and resisting the nomenclature, Drexel off-I-Seals had decided there were more important battles to fight. Were good for America. Inside the firm there was a 2-week-long celebration, open to all employees, of seminars, sports events and LMS, all devoted to this proposition. Thousands of square green pins were distributed, reading, "Junk bonds keep America fit." One music video, along more general morale-boosting lines, showed Drexel employees mouthing the words to a hit song by Billy Ocean. "When the going gets tough," chanted Bob Linton and Fred Joseph along with brokers and mail clerks, "Drexel gets going." The message Drexel was attempting to convey in its in-house and public campaigns was that junk bonds provided the only access to the public debt market for mainstream America, 95% of American businesses. That the companies that issued them were the vital, growing sector of American industry that had provided new jobs in the last decade, while the employee ranks at investment-grade giants were declining. There was a sort of truth to this. The 95% figure is somewhat obfuscating. Drexel's reasoning went this way. There are about 23,000 companies in the United States with sales over $25 million. Only 800 of them, however, qualify for investment-grade ratings. Therefore, that leaves some 22,000, or 95%, that are in the junk bailiwick. The problem with this arithmetic is that the vast majority of those 22,000 companies have not applied for ratings and have not issued junk bonds. From 1977 to 1986, about 1,200 companies, not 22,000, became issuers, of over $114 billion of junk bonds. The job formation claims suffered from a similar vulnerability. In the last 3 years, Drexel stated in 1987, "America's largest companies have been cutting their workforce. They have decreased employment by 4%. Junk issuers, however, have expanded employment by over 24%. What was left unsaid was the fact that the employment roles at some of those large companies had been cut after defensive restructurings, undertaken to fend off Drexel-backed bidders. Sometimes Drexel attacked the problem head-on, as in ads stating that a prevalent misconception is that junk bonds are responsible for the recent proliferation of hostile takeover activity. On the contrary, Drexel asserted, less than 10% of successful tender offers, 1981 to 86, were funded by junk bonds. True enough, except that the junk bond financed hostile takeover had only 2 preliminary runs, Mesa Gulf and Reliance Disney, prior to 1985. And this statistic also omits, of course, all those raids which threw off hundreds of millions in Professor ITS to the bidder, the shareholders and Drexel, which intensified the fever of restructuring through corporate America, but which did not take their targets. In the last few months of 1987, however, Drexel forsook such didacticism in favor of a softer, more impressionistic approach. One full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal featured a photograph of a group of workers at an Arkansas steel plant, where Drexel claimed to have saved jobs through its financing for the plant's parent company, Quanex. Another showed a picture of a couple, the wife pregnant, and their toddler in front of a house under construction, being built by Hovnanian, a company which, without its access to junk bonds, would not have been able to provide 50,000 people with a living room and 20,000 people with a living. Drexel also took its campaign to television, spending some $4 million. In late, 87 2/60-second commercials, in the same soft, sentimental vein as the recent print ads, appeared. One of them featured an energy plant in Vidalia, Louisiana, whose construction was financed by Drexel's junk bonds, with a resultant reduction in unemployment in Vidalia by over 20%. Before the plant was built, the commercial stated, over 16% of the residents of Vidalia had been unemployed. Among the problems here, as pointed out in an article by Wall Street Journal reporter Lori Cohen, was that the commercial was not shot in Vidalia. That unemployment statistics for Vidalia, as distinguished from the surrounding parish, do not exist. That a Louisiana Department of Labor official stated he disagreed with the claim that the plant had helped to reduce unemployment by 20%, and that moreover most of the people who worked at the plant didn't live in Vidalia. In its eagerness to alter its image radically, from the host of decadents at the Predators Ball, the Raiders' money machine, the firearm that in 1985–86 gave new meaning to greed on Wall Street, to a wholesome, civic-minded provider of capital, and thereby jobs, to this nation's little people, Drexel was fudging facts. The problem, however, was not so much these specific obfuscations as the overall image. Drexel had provided financing for growth to small and medium-sized companies which would have had trouble finding capital elsewhere. It had built a thriving market of this original issue debt where none had existed before. It could reasonably sustain the claim made in its 87 ad campaign that it had furthered the democratization of capital. But if Drexel had limited itself to that initial source of supply, never financing the buyouts, or the leveraged acquisitions of 1985–86, it would have remained one of the second-class citizens of Wall Street, highly Professor I table, because of those 3 to 4% spreads, but barely noticed by the premier RMS and their clients. It would have been an outsider in the M&A world, instead of its hot center. Without that new supply source, the junk market, the best barometer of Drexel's influence, would never have increased in size so quickly. In 1981, before Drexel had started issuing junk for LBOs, the new issue market was $1.30 billion. In 1986, a year when the new issue market increased by 52%, it was $32.40 billion, not including private placements. And all junk debt outstanding was approximately $125 billion. While Drexel was striving to expunge from history its period of triumph and sovereignty, it was not disowning the king. It is true that in the early months of the investigation, when Drexel employees feared that indictments and perhaps the FIRM's collapse were imminent, there had been some sentiment in New York that Milken and his troops should be cut adrift. But as time passed without indictments, hope grew that the government was having difficulty making its case, and solidarity took hold. As one Drexel employee claimed in the summer of 1987, when hope was probably at its high point, the government is right in principle, and maybe in fact, but they won't be able to prove it. No one is going to tell on Mike, who didn't take bags of money like Marty Siegel, who took satchels LLED with money from Boesky in return for inside information, but broke the securities laws. And who made them very rich. Issues that had been sore points within Drexel prior to Boesky Day, such as Milken's FL outing the decisions of the UAC, now were put aside in favor of a united front. The troubled deals list seemed to have evaporated. In a New York Times article by James Sterngold in November 1987, Joseph insisted that Milken had lost arguments before the UAC. Joseph was supported in this claim by other, unnamed Drexel executives, who said that Milken had pushed hard to do an underwriting for Rooney, Pace, for example, and that deal nonetheless had been rejected. True enough. Except that was the deal, listing Rooney, Pace itself as the underwriter, which was then placed by Milken. The judgment of the UAC was vindicated, moreover, inasmuch as within 1 year of that offering Rooney, Pace was all but broke and it had defaulted on the second interest payment on the bonds. In its now fully engaged struggle for survival, an attitude had evolved at Drexel which might win the day, or at least mitigate defeat, if successfully imparted by its defense lawyers to a jury. It could be summed up with this statement: a 13D violation isn't murder. Translated into strategy, it meant attempting to fragment any pattern of conduct, isolating its particulars, an alleged 13D violation here, a claimed parking violation there, and then minimizing their significance. Indeed, if seen separately, Milken's actions could be effectively trivialized. Assume, for the moment, that the following were true: the mass distribution of privately placed bonds. Milken's buying bonds and alerting favored customers, such as Tom Spiegel, Fred Carr and Jay Regan, to do so before an announcement of an exchange offer, such as in the Caesars World issue. The failure to disclose, except to some favored investors, who may then have bought the stock, that the Pantry Pride, blind pool, was actually intended for the acquisition of Revlon, an undisclosed arrangement with Boesky and Fischbach, and an undisclosed arrangement with Saul Steinberg and Wicks. Any one of the above, by itself, might seem an offense which, if proven, could be plea bargained away without severe sanction. But seen in concert, and in concert as how they must be seen if any true sense of Milken's machine is to be grasped, these individual acts take on different dimensions. Their gravity becomes inescapable. Indeed, it seems plain to this writer that if the above or some similar assortment of Milken's and, by extension, Drexel's actions are not worth prosecuting, then the securities laws were not worth passing. Assuming these actions occurred, it is difficult for this writer to imagine a manipulation of the securities markets that is more broad, more powerful or more frightening. What Drexel could be banking on, of course, was that the fully integrated, multidimensional picture would remain forever shrouded in Milken's legendary secrecy, and that those bits and pieces that did emerge could be kept separate and trivialized. As 1987 drew to a close, however, despite the FIRM's united, defiant front, the hope of the summer that indictments might not come had ebbed away. Morale, again, was sagging. Reserves of at least $500 million had been set aside in expectation of a civil fine that the firm would have to pay, according to several sources close to Drexel. And the future of Drexel as envisioned by some had begun to bear a grim resemblance to its distant past. "Drexel is dead," commented one banker in the firm. "Not in the short term, and I don't mean literally dead. But Drexel as we have known it is gone. Even if we win at trial, our reputation, already so tarnished, will be so much more tarnished that it will hardly matter. We won't be doing the big deals anymore. We won't be making the same money. And the good people, little by little, will leave, because if you're not going to make that kind of money anymore, why not at least be at a firm with a good reputation, where you can be involved in big deals?" Asked whether Joseph shared this view, that Drexel would now fall back to the point from which its meteoric rise had started a decade ago, this banker shook his head. "Fred is still FIGHTING," he said. And Milken was in the vanguard of that fight. By the summer of '87, off-ice SEALs at Drexel had apparently decided that as a countervailing weight to Milken's violations on the scales of justice there should be Milken himself. He had long been the FI-RM's single greatest asset. He had briefly been perceived as its single greatest liability. But wasn't he still the best thing Drexel had? Shouldn't they play from their strength, however odd? Lawyers for Drexel started referring to him as a national treasure. Before the start of the government investigation, some of Milken's admirers had spoken wistfully of harnessing his energy to the federal government. They pictured him, for example, as the Secretary of the Treasury, his obsession with increasing his fortune and his influence over corporate destinies in this country replaced by an obsession with the budget deficit, the trade deficit, Latin American debt. The idea of Milken in the cabinet would remain sheer fantasy, but Milken's lawyers needed to convince the government that he was a human being so visionary, and so willing to serve in a private capacity, that he was simply not expendable. At about the same time that his lawyers began referring to Milken as a national treasure, Milken had let it be known that he would be devoting up to 25% of his time to the Latin American debt crisis. He made trips to Mexico to discuss international debt with President Miguel de la Madrid. This was not a new project at Drexel. A Latin American debt team from Citibank, headed by Gerald Finneran, had been hired in 1985, but it was certainly being given new emphasis. In October '87, Drexel announced that the DBL Americas Development Association had been capitalized with $170 million of equity, raised from 40 U.S. corporations. Its aim was to invest principally in equity and convertible debt securities of Latin American businesses. It might also purchase debt securities and use them in debt for debt or debt for equity swaps. If Drexel possessed any original solution to the crisis, however, it was being kept under wraps. And $170 million would hardly make a substantial dent in a $600 billion problem. Skeptics referred to this as Milken's missionary work. Milken also made his press debut. Under carefully controlled conditions, he would not discuss the investigation, and he would have the right to approve the use of any quotes. In context, he met with a handful of journalists. That he did so at all served to underscore his plight. He had always distrusted the press. It was inimical to his penchant for secrecy, and outside of his control. Happily for him, considering that distrust, he had not needed it for his business. As he used to say to Steve Wynn, "You can't make a dime off publicity." In the early days, his investors had been glad that Milken and his arcane bonds kept a low Professor Ila, the better for the spread. Once Drexel entered the spotlight as the backer of the junk bond takeover and needed a spokesman, Fred Joseph had assumed the role. But now the mystique that had long surrounded the cloistered Milken was suggestive of secret, illicit dealings. He had to come into the light. Moreover, it was hoped that as a national treasure, personally revealed for the first time, Milken might be Drexel's hidden ace. That was unlikely. Years of reclusiveness coupled with Milken's extraordinary feats had engendered a legend that was larger than the man. He had been widely portrayed as a profoundly enigmatic and mesmerizing figure who caused even non-believers to fall under his spell. In a long interview and subsequent conversations with this reporter in late '87, however, Milken was deeply knowledgeable about his 20-year obsession but not spellbinding, and more transparent than enigmatic. If Drexel off-ice SEALs were hoping for magic as Milken went public, he would disappoint them. Milken speaks often about the importance of remembering one's roots. He certainly has done so. He married his high school sweetheart. He left New York for California when it was unthinkable that someone who aspired to success on Wall Street should do so. He moved back to his old neighborhood in the unfashionable San Fernando Valley, where he remained after accumulating his hundreds of millions of dollars. He brought his brother and high school friends into his group. Unlike some powerful individuals who assiduously remold themselves in the course of their ascent, Milken made no such effort. Perhaps as a consequence of that, one can still see vestiges today of the oddness that always set him apart, making him slightly misfitted for any group but the one he eventually created. He was, after all, the teenager who slept only 3 or 4 hours a night, who was not the football player but the cheerleader, who in LA and Berkeley in the 60s not only never smoked or drank or experimented with drugs but did not even drink carbonated beverages. He was the new Wharton student, made fun of by his pipe-smoking Ivy League classmates, but vowing he would be number one in his class. He was the Jew at the Blue Blood Drexel Firestone, segregated off in a corner of the trading floor. He was the bond trader at Drexel Burnham who, even as he began making millions trading his strange bonds, still looked so strange, with his shirt and tie combinations that made him the brunt of others' jokes, with his dreadful rug that Saul Steinberg once, in a bit of off-ICE horseplay, pulled off his head. He was the Drexel junk bond trader from California, no less, who, when he asserted to a roomful of investment bankers and lawyers in '83 that he could raise $4 minus $5 billion for Boone Pickens' Mesa Gulf bid, which Pickens was having trouble financing, was greeted by snickers from the men from Cravath, Swain and Moore, and Lehman Brothers, the aristocrats of the street. Milken must have been determined from his youth to show the world just how smart he was, and to make wealth his measure. One of his favorite anecdotes concerns a recent Wharton graduate who returned to the school to speak while Milken was a student. The graduate had blue blood credentials. He had attended a prestigious prep school and an Ivy League college. He was 29 years old, and he told the assembled group of students he was worth $30 million. Milken was impressed. But what emerged a little later, the punchline that so delighted Milken, was that the young multimillionaire had inherited $50 million when he was 25. This was the individual squandering wealth analog to those corporate disaster stories Milken also loved, about the blue chip, AAA companies that lost hundreds of millions, even billions, of dollars of capital in foolish business decisions. The moral, of course, was that however impressive appearances might be, it was not birth, not a prestige education, and not inherited wealth that counted at the continuing, year-after-year bottom line, but performance. Nothing else. Milken resolved to outperform them all. And for him, high-yielding bonds were a custom-made vehicle. They were the outcasts and misfits of the securities world. Disdained by the rating agencies and the establishment, many of them victims of misconceptions. In that gap between perception and reality, as Milken liked to say, there was money to be made. Later, when he began to underwrite them, and when they were eventually used by his chosen, the outsiders of American business life, to challenge the corporate giants, his operation of course metamorphosed into something far larger and more powerful than even the far-sighted Milken could have dreamed when he first started trading these contemned bonds at Drexel Firestone in 1970. But the whole long journey, starting with the bus ride from Cherry Hill and culminating at the pinnacle of power in American finance, was an unbroken continuum. Milken's group, the first one ever which fit him like a glove, had been cloaked in mystery for years. As bits and pieces of information emerged, they added descriptive detail to the image of the peculiar, cult-like whole, but did not explain it. Milken, however, did that. It became clear, in listening to him, that his group was the physical embodiment of his theory of productivity, fused with his need for absolute control. Milken believed that people were at their most productive when they felt they were part of a collective enterprise. There could, therefore, be no stars, and that included him. That was why he refused to have his picture in Drexel's annual report. It would detract from the team spirit. He had no off-ICE, only his desk on the trading floor, for the same reason. He had no meaningful title in the firm, and there were no meaningful titles in his group. No one was to be ranked over someone else. As Milken had mentioned, his group's Christmas card, in the form of a bond, was an undifferentiated printing of the names of all its members, a graphic illustration of this principle. He would not, of course, have allowed the members of his group to speak to the press, because of his insistence upon secrecy and control, but he also mentioned that he did not want his people to start thinking of themselves as stars. It would be harder to motivate them, come 4:30 Monday morning. Keeping his people pure, consumed and fixated on the work at hand, was his perpetual effort. Milken believed that two of life's major distractions, romance and wealth, were counterproductive, diminishing the kind of intensity he required of his people. He therefore advocated long-term, stable relationships. He took pride in what he claimed was the group's low divorce rate. Wealth, of course, was a double-edged sword for Milken. Its achievement, largely through the equity stakes in the investment partnerships, was what gave his people incentive. But once he had made his people wealthy beyond their imaginings in order to both motivate them and bind them to him, that very wealth tended to divert them with life's pleasures. Milken attempted to cure this dilemma through control. Much of his people's wealth, of course, was in the investment partnerships, kept out of their reach, although as the years went on and the accumulated wealth of the group grew mountainous, a substantial portion did reach its owners. Still, when Milken was displeased, he manipulated the levers of the partnerships, reducing someone's existing percentage, freezing him out of the next. There were other, more subtle but probably more powerful means of control, understood by any charismatic, messianic leader. Milken sought to inspire by example. He expected no one to work any harder than he did, and as his power increased he worked the same punishing hours he always had, or longer. He climbed no social, and time-consuming, ladder. He had been married to the same woman, with whom he had 3 children, since 1968. He lived simply, rejecting the symbols of materialism that he wanted his people to reject, in emulation. He lived in the valley, not in decadent, splashy Beverly Hills, and he urged his people, also, to buy homes outside of Beverly Hills. Many, indeed, lived in the valley. For a man who was driven by limitless greed, one could hear the pleasure that money gave. Sometimes, when he spoke, he espoused, in terms of lifestyle, anti-materialism. Everything, but everything, in Milken's life, and, if he had his way, in his people's lives, was subsumed to productivity. Milken meant to inspire so that his people would feel like cathedral builders, not bricklayers, and he did so. If he was walking over a cliff, declared one former disciple, everyone in that group would have followed him. As Milken himself suggested with his allusion to Gandhi, he had not built this holy army for the sole purpose of buying and selling securities. It had begun that way. But by the late 70s, when Milken was providing capital to an underclass of corporate America that had not been able to obtain it before, he had started to envision his larger purpose. That was also when he moved back to California and began building his cadre in earnest. One of its former members recounted that in 1979 he had read a thriller, The Matarese Circle, by Robert Ludlum, whose plot revolves around a worldwide terrorist conspiracy orchestrated and financed through the largest multinational corporations. The goal of the Matarese fanatics, who are so imbued with their cause that they willingly sacrifice themselves, is to plunge the established world powers into chaos and then impose their own new order, in which all power will be held by the Matarese through the corporations they control. The conspiracy's mastermind is a brilliant, megalomaniac naif. Once a Corsican shepherd boy, he has built an inestimable fortune and is so consumed by his vision of world control that he bends everything in life to its shape. My nickname for Michael was the Shep, commented this former disciple. A few other people in the group read it, and they saw it, too. The incredible thing was, that was 1979. And then, over the next 5 or 6 years, we watched it happen. The comparison to the murderous shepherd boy, of course, is not meant to be taken literally. But the parallel that struck this former member of Milken's group lay in the force of the obsession, the megalomania, the conviction of a cause so just that the end justified the means, and, finally, the conceptualization of the corporate vehicle as a means of extending control nationwide, and then worldwide. The Michael Milken interviewed by this reporter displayed no hint of such rapacity. Though naturally intense, he seemed to strive for a casual manner. He was painstakingly modest, praising the achievements of others at Drexel, repeatedly attempting to shift the focus from himself. He refused to criticize rivals at other investment banking firms, though he was well aware that many of them show no such restraint about him and Drexel. He spoke repeatedly of his pride in having financed companies which had been small, or in dire financial straits, when he underwrote their bonds, and which had grown and prospered, not via acquisition. He described Drexel's paradigmatic trait as an eagerness to help. He pointedly mentioned his being around to help in the hard times that would come in the future, as he has been in earlier hard times. The problem with all this was its utter transparency. Milken, the world's greatest bond salesman, was now attempting to sell himself, as a low-key, humble, beneficent public servant type, who makes more money than other public servants because he does his version in the private sector.
I welcome competition, insisted the individual whose hallmark since the 70s had been his relentless craving for 100% market share, who for years when competition arose would try to either crush it or buy it.
What this sales pitch showed, more than anything else, was Milken's shockingly poor judgment about himself in relation to others, to the wider world. A world that is not conference Ned, as his has been for so long, to his beloved bonds. Nearly 2 years earlier, when he was approached by this reporter after the speech he gave to the money managers in Boston, and was asked for his cooperation with this book, Milken replied that he had heard about the book from Fred Joseph. He asked a few questions about its genesis and its aims and then declared, "I do not want it to be done." When he was told that it was already in progress, he reiterated that he did not want it done. He seemed surprised, almost, by the assurance that it would be done. Then he said, "I was saying to Fred, why don't we pay you the commitment fee that your publisher would have paid you, except we'll pay it to you to not write the book?" Or, he went on, as though he had not heard the response, "Why don't we pay you for all the copies you would have sold if you had written it?" That was in February 1986. That was Milken in his prime, at the very apex of his power. Assuming that in the wider world, as in trading, a price exists at which any transaction can be done, comfortable that the end justifies the means. Determined that nothing which he did not control should come close to him. So cloistered, and so accustomed to people's hanging on his words and bending to his will, Milken had not had any idea how to relate to the world outside his own. He never had. But it seemed hardly to matter while the parameters of his world, in which he was not a misfit but sovereign, were so wide, and growing by the day. He was feared by his enemies, idolized by his followers. He was soon to be universally lauded by the business press and slavishly imitated by the rest of Wall Street. Many billions of dollars were at his command. Capital, as Milken had been saying and proving for a long time, was not a scarce resource. The only limits to his power, it seemed, would be the limits of his febrile imagination. After the speech to the money managers, many of whom he had Phi RST met nearly a decade earlier when he came knocking on their doors, peddling his oddball product, Milken was surrounded by well-wishers paying tribute. One longtime client, unable to see him through the press of the crowd, asked Milken's assistant, Susan Cochran, where he was. "The king," she said, with a nod in his direction, "is over there." Acknowledgements. This book is the result of interviews I conducted with 250 to 300 people, during a 2.5-year period. Many of these people I interviewed many times, often for interviews of several hours' duration. Some of their names appear. Others said that they could speak candidly to me only on a background basis, meaning that their comments would not be attributed to them. While I interviewed dozens of people who had been antagonists of Drexel and its players, the overwhelming majority of my interviews were with the subjects of my book themselves, employees of Drexel and its network of clients, the hosts and the guests of the Predators Ball. Fred Joseph's agreement to cooperate with this book spoke for all of the Phi with the exception of the West Coast, Milken and his group, a bifurcation that, as I would learn over the next 2 years, was a way of life within Drexel. Joseph agreed to grant me access in February 1986, 9 months before Boski Day. I therefore had the opportunity to learn about Drexel and its players at a time when their idol was at its height. Awash in triumph, people spoke quite freely. Had I started to do the reporting on this book after Boski Day, when the Drexel saga went from being publicly perceived as the success story of Wall Street to, perhaps, its greatest embarrassment and scandal, I would never have been granted such a frank and full view, by the participants themselves. My meetings with Milken were the bookends of this project, coming at the beginning, when I asked for his cooperation, and very close to the end, when I received it. I feel confidence that he never would have decided to go public if he were not in effect Phi Ghtting for his life, in this battle that must be his worst nightmare. The government's strobe lights playing mercilessly over what was once his perfectly controlled universe, full of secret pools and pockets known to him alone. Milken almost surely believes, as some close to him have indicated, that he is paying the price not so much, or not at all, for having violated the law, but for having led the revolt of an underclass to scale the walls of corporate America and depose the rich, credentialed and powerful. This he did indeed do, and for this I, while not endorsing his selection of players to replace the captains and the kings, applaud him. Although I suspected when I set out to write this book that this stunning success story might well have some unholy if not illegal underpinnings, my sympathies were more toward Milken and his band of renegades than toward the corporate establishment they were attacking. To the extent that Milken, particularly, feels he is judged harshly here, he should know that these are judgments that were neither predetermined nor fueled by prejudice but that simply became, after more than 2 years of reporting, unavoidable. Realizing the irony involved, I would nonetheless like to thank the many people at Drexel who spent countless hours explaining to me the workings of their world. The Phi is of course Phi LLED with honest, very bright, hard-working people. I hope they will enjoy at least those parts of the book that describe the glory days of Drexel. Drexel has been a much-covered story over the past couple of years, and articles by other reporters helped me in writing this book. Among them were pieces by James Stewart and Daniel Hertzberg in the Wall Street Journal, Chris Wells and Tony Bianco in Businessweek, Alan Sloan and Howard Rudnitsky in Forbes, James Sterngold in the New York Times, and Kerry Reich in Institutional Investor. One researcher, Natalie Byfield, assisted me in the early days of this project, and she was followed by Todd Woody, who assisted me over the longer haul. I am grateful to both of them. My fact-checker, Karen Dillon, was superb, with a spirit and determination that kept going when mine started to flag. Her services were lent to me by the American lawyer, whose editor and publisher, Stephen Brill, has provided me with unstinting and vital support from the first moment of this undertaking to its last. His 1985 piece in The American Lawyer about Icon's raid on Phillips Petroleum, entitled The Roaring '80s, provided the initial inspiration for this book. I owe him a considerable debt of gratitude. I want to thank my editor at Simon & Schuster, Alice Mayhew, whose legendary abilities I can now attest are real. I am fortunate indeed to have had the benefit of them. I also want to express my gratitude to her assistant, David Shipley, and to Elizabeth McNamara, associate counsel at Simon & Schuster, whose sound judgment was a great asset in the closing days of this book. Finally, I want to thank my friend Deirdre Fanning, who provided a tireless and excellent sounding board. My mother and father, both of whom have never doubted for a moment that I could do anything, and always have tried to make it possible for me to do everything. My brother, David, for his continual generosity. And my son, who, through years of enduring either uncooked or burned dinners, fits of temper and general abstractedness, has displayed the patience, cheer and relentless humor that have made my life bright. Connie Bruck. February 1988. We hope you enjoyed reading this Simon & Schuster ebook. Join our mailing list and get updates on new releases, deals, bonus content and other great books from Simon & Schuster. Click here to sign up or visit us online to sign up at ebook news. simonandschuster.com. Index. Abacassis, Paul, 202, 218, 223, 235–236. AB Electrolux, 155. ACF, 19, 161, 163–64, 169, 173, 185, 186, 190–91. ACI, American Communications Industries, 73–74, 76, 306. Ackerman, Peter, 83–84, 108, 288, 306. Adams, Joseph, 179. Adler and Shakin, 219, 221, 234, 235. Airfund, 101–2, 106, 131, 168, 344. See also, Hiley Conference Ident, Letter Airline Business, Problems of, 171, 172. Albright, Archibald, 31. Alexander, Norman, 285–86. Allen, Herbert, 111. Allen and Company, 65, 111, 249. Alliance for Capital Access, 259. Altman, Edward, 268. American Can Company, 18, 135, 141, 142, 147, 161. American Communications Industries, ACI, 73–74, 76, 306. American Financial Corporation, 35, 36, 38, 83, 93, 290. National Condil End, 124, 131, 132. American General Capital Management, 55–56, 277. American Home Products, 219. American Metal Climax, 272. American National Can, 147. American Natural Resources Company, ANR, 13, 107, 131, 204. Amir, Paul, 115, 116. Anaconda Copper Company, 97. Anchor Hawking, 161. Anderson, G. Christian, 46, 245 to 46, 249, 264. IBG End, 338 to 40. Animal Metaphors and Imagery, 64. Animal Metaphors and Imagery, 64. Annuities, Single Premium Deferred, SPDA, 90.
ANR, American Natural Resources Company 13, 107, 131, 203 to 4. Antisemitism, 29, 36, 205, 331. Anti-takeover legislation and maneuvers, 160, 171, 177, 259, 260 to 65. Poison pill, 168, 216, 217, 224, 226, 256. Arbitrage, arbitrageurs, 35, 75, 207, 215, 281, 305 to 6, 317, 320, 321. Proxy Phi GHTS compared with 155. Risk versus Classic, 152, 162.
Ashland Oil, 257. Atalanta, Sosnoff Capital Corporation, 131 to 32. Atkinson, R., 28. Atlantic Capital, 132, 168, 280 to 84, 327. Atlantic City, New Jersey, 58 to 59. Atlantic Rich I. Eld., 94, 134, 272. Attorneys off ICE, U.S., 330. Avedon, Richard, 238 to 39. Avery, 141 to 44. Aylward, David, 259. Baird and Warner, 154. Balance sheets. F.L. Exable, 75. Leveraging of, 99 to 100. Baldwin, Robert, 30. Balser, Donald, 320, 342. Bankers Trust, 114, 118, 210. Banking, Banks, 36 to 37, 269, 282. In Drexel Deals, 246. Drexel's displacement of, 246. Investment. See Investment Banking, Investment Bankers Merchant, 66, 191, 248, 249 to 50, 288 to 89, 308, 321. See also Bridge Financing Mergers and Acquisitions and 97, 210 to 11. Revlon Battle End, 210 to 11. Bankruptcies, 33 to 34, 64, 74, 112, 128, 182, 287. Chapter 11, 18, 111, 124, 139, 193, 292, 293 of LTV Corporation, 268 to 69. Banner Industries, 144, 305. Banque Commerciale Privée, 159, 160. Barron's, 245. Base Family, 278. Base Investment Limited Partnership, 278. Battis, Inc., 160. Bayswater, 154 to 55, 160. Bear, Stearns, 81, 128, 198, 199, 346. Beatrice Companies, 143, 245, 250, 258, 273 to 74, 347. Beck, Jeffrey, 253. Beecham Group, 232. Belvedere Securities, 81 to 83, 279, 300, 311, 312. Beltzberg, Hyman, 12–14, 16, 35, 93, 120, 125, 168, 257. Beltzberg, Sam, 12–14, 16, 35, 93, 125, 168, 257. Reliance LP and 120. Revlon Battle and 212. Beltzberg, William, 12–14, 16, 35, 93, 120, 125, 168, 257. Bergerac, Michel, 193–97, 203, 207, 213, 219–22, 224, 227–30, 239 defense moves of 210, 211, 216 financial settlement of 232 gloomy predictions of 235. Levine and 235 lifestyle of 228, 237, 239–40. Perelman celebration and 230–31 on Perelman's social climbing. 237 personality of 194. Berkshire Hathaway, 118, 347. Bernheim Forests, 30. Bara, Yogi, 296. Beverly Hills Hotel Corporation, 319. Beverly Hills Savings, 115–17. Bilger, Arthur, 245, 298–99, 304, 331. Black, Eli, 65, 287. Black, Leon, 100, 143, 176, 287, 295. Background of 65. Bonus of 247. Fee paragraph in memos of 304. Fee paragraph in memos of 304. Icon end 162–63, 165–66, 167, 171, 173–74, 178, 179–80, 186, 245 on Joseph Doctrine, 170. Milken praised by 245. Milken's relationship with 319–320. National Condil end 106, 108, 124–27, 129 on Robber Barons, 65, 149, 245. TWA deal end 171, 173–74, 176–180. Blind pools 18, 117, 132, 141, 180, 212, 213, 277, 282, 295, 305, 352. Bloodham, Charles, 67, 110. Blumenthal, Michael, 211. Blythe Eastman Dillon and Company, 47. Boesky, Ivan, 10, 35, 118, 164, 190, 305–6 at Predators Ball, 1985, 14, 16–17. Reliance LP and 120. SEC investigations of 305–6, 312, 318. Boesky Day, 317–37, 342, 351. Joseph and 329, 335–37. SEC and 318, 320–30. Smoking Gun and 342–43. Bond funds, high yield, see high yield bond funds. Bonds. Bankruptcies end, 33 to 34. Chinese paper, 27, 38, 44, 75, 120 commodity related, 71 to 72 convertible debt, 27, 28, 38, 69, 152, 269 coupon on, 73, 82 deductibility of interest on, 37, deep discount, fallen angels, 27, 38, 44, 119, 346 discount trading of, 27, 289 downgrading of, 27 face, par, value of, 27, 93 high coupon, high premium, 71 junk. See junk bonds, junk bond takeovers. Penn Central, 34, 112. People Express, 249, 287 prices of, interest rates and, 70. Prices of, interest rates and, 70. Rating of, 27, 32. Reckless use of, 37 to 38 shorted, 52 straight debt, 27, 28 swapping of, 289 AAA, 27, 32, 243. U.S. Treasury, see Treasury bonds, U.S. with warrants, 69, 71, 73 to 74, 114 to 15, 120, 289. Boylan, Michael, 244 to 45 bracketing, 30. Bradford, Michael, 264 to 65. Bradley, Bill, 258. Brandt, Peter, 190. Brazil, 197. Brenner, Howard, 331. Bridge Club, the 250 bridge financing, 165, 248, 249 to 51, 345 to 46. See also commitment letters and fees. Bright Star, 305. Brown, David, 178, 180, 318. Brown Forman Distillers Corporation, 256. Brownstein, Andrew, 211, 216, 217. Brumberger, Alan, 109, 132 to 33, 341. Buffett, Warren, 118. Buford, Anthony Jr., 24 to 25. Bungalow 8, Beverly Hills Hotel, 15, 17, 135, 141, 183, 340. Burnham, I.W., 2, Tubby, 29 to 32, 42, 48, 57, 259, 302 to 3. Boesky Day End, 330 to 31. Milken End, 31 to 32, 34 to 35, 50, 51 to 52, 69. Public Company Debate End, 69. Win End, 59. Burnham and Company, 29 to 31, 42, 43, 51 as Jewish Phi Erm, 31. Burnout, 252 to 53. Burroughs, 258. Business Week, 66, 92, 120, 138 to 41, 145, 151, 186, 254, 268, 270, 290, 335. Buyback at a premium, Bon Voyage bonus, 156. Icon's congressional testimony on 162. See also Greenmail. Caesar's World, 308 to 12, 328, 352. Cahill, Gordon and Reindl, 205. Cambrent Financial Group, 54. Cameron, Dort, 3, 83 to 84, 182, 278. Cannella, John, 172 to 73. Canterbury Group, 81. Capital Cities, ABC, 145. Carlyle Associates, 81. Carr, Fred, 89–90. 93, 119, 182, 270, 276, 280, 311–12, 322. Market competition encouraged by 287. National Can Deal End, 124, 132, 134. Revlon Battle End, 212. Carter Hawley Hale, 160, Cash Cow, Strategy, 262. Cash FL 171, 172, 199. Def I Ned, 112–13. Cashin, Richard, 289. Causey, Charles, 35, 83–84, 253. Kaywood, James, 12, 55, 60, 277, 287. Kaywood Christian Capital Management, 12, 277. CBS, 217. Cell Products, 116–17. Central Jersey Industries, CJI, 141, 144. Centronics Data Computer Corporation, 339. Certif I Cates of Deposit, 91. Chanticleer Investors, Limited, 81. Chapman, Alger, Duke, 41. Chapter 11 Bankruptcy, 18, 111, 124, 139, 193, 292, 293. Charles of the Ritz, 234. Chasen's, Beverly Hills, Dinners at 14–15, 183, 260, 341. Chemical Bank, 36–37, 210–11. Chicago Board Options Exchange, 152, 160, 300. Chinese Paper, 27, 38, 44, 75, 120. Chinese Wall, 306–8. Churchill, Winston, 258. Cinerama, 199–200. Circus, 60. Citibank, 210, 277, 289. Citicorp, 136, 289. Clarendon, 281–84. Clark, Douglas, 26. Clark Gable Estates, 53–54. Clayton and Dubelier, 99, 142. Clore, Allen, 159, 196. CNA, Insurance Company, 35, 83. Coastal Corporation, 13–14, 107, 127, 130, 131, 203–4, 208. Cochrane, Susan, 359. Coffee Mat, 110–12. Kogan, Marshall, 79. Kogut, Craig, 54. Cohen, Claudia, 198, 218, 236. Cohen, Lori, 348. Cohen Haddif I. Eld Industries, 198, 238. Cohn, Roy, 201. Coleman, Bertram, 25. Collins and Aikman Corporation, 295. Columbia Pictures, 111. Columbia Savings and Loan, 89, 91–94, 132, 167, 182, 272, 291, 311. In Milken's Money Machine, 276–277. Political contributions of 259, 260. Comdisco, 347. Commissions and fees, 286. FIXED. End of 63 for underwriting, 46, 47, 66, 74, 300, 304 commitment letters and fees, 107, 129, 134, 165 to 66, 181 commodity-related bonds, 71 to 72. Compact video, 305. Company Bruxelles Lambert, 48 to 49, 62 competition, 291, 296. Junk bonds and 47 to 48, 71, 209, 248 to 51, 287. Milken's views on 249, 358 takeovers effects on 262, 263. Conan, Joan, 278. Concordia, 333. Congress, U.S., 34, 91, 162, 166, 167, 172, 203 to 7, 259 to 63. Law's testimony to 262 to 63. Lipton's testimony for 204 to 5. Rahatan's testimony for 206 to 7. Shearer's testimony to 261 to 62, 263. See also House of Representatives, U.S., Senate, U.S. Conoco, 134 consent decrees, 37, 120, 160, 279, 321. Considine, Frank, 105, 122 to 26, 135 to 136, 138, 140, 145, 147 to 48. Owner-managers as viewed by 263. Consolidated Cigar, 198. Continental, 173, 175. Convertible debt, 28, 38, 152, 269. Def I Ned, 27. Hybrid, Western, 69. Corporate America. Milken's transformation of 14, 19. Milken's views on 12. Corporate bond quality and investor experience. Hickman, 11. Corporations. Below investment grade, 11, 45. Investment grade, Def I Ned, 27. Mergers of, see junk bonds, junk bond takeovers, takeovers. Rating of 10 to 11, 27, 45. Cosmetics business, 234 to 35. Koss, Lawrence, 290 to 92. Coupons, on bonds, 73, 82. CPC International, 233. Crane, 97. Cranston, Allen, 258. Credit cycle, Grant's theory of 268. Credit cycle, Grant's theory of 268. Crown Zellerbach Corporation, 17, 208. Quosie, Howard, 279. Dahl, James, 116 to 17, 291, 311, 325, 334, 336 to 37. D'Amato, Alphonse M., 171, 259 to 60. Dan River, 161. Davis, Martin, 200, 294 to 95. Davis, Marvin, 145. Dalen Company, 39, 292, 326. DBL Americas Development Association, 353. Dean, James, 271. Dean Witter, 65. Debt. Convertible, see convertible debt. In fall of 1986, 269. Grant's views on 266 to 68 preferred stock compared with 265 refinancing of 108 to 9, 250, 269, 290 senior, 45 to 46, 98, 123 to 24, 166 straight, 27, 28 subordinated, 45 to 46, 59, 123, 166, 246 tax law and 263 to 64. Third World, 254 to 55, 353 debt to equity ratios, 262, 269, 310, deep discount, bonds, fallen angels, 27, 38, 44, 119, 346 de la Madrid Hurtado, Miguel, 353. De Laurentiis, Dino, 54. Delaware Chancery Court, 199, 225–27, 232. Delaware State Supreme Court, 218, 227 Depreciation, 113, 172 Deregulation, 91, 97, 171. Diamond Shamrock, 322. Dillon, Reed & Company, 30 Discount Bond Mutual Funds, 33. Walt Disney, 13, 107, 164, 167, 291 Diversify Cation, 46, 199, 251–53 Divestitures. Law's Views on, 263. Revlon End, 210, 211, 231. Dole, Robert, 258–59. Dominic and Dominic, 43. Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette. DLJ, Inc. 164, 169, 251, 253, 334. Dorchester Government Securities, 82, 300, 312. Dorfman, Dan, 257. Dove, Guy, 3, 132, 279–80, 282, 284, 327. Drapkin, Donald, 135, 136. Revlon Battle End, 194, 196, 199, 208, 215, 218, 220, 222, 225–26, 234, 237–39 Salary of, 237–38. Drexel, Francis, 26. Drexel, Morgan and Company, 26. Drexel and Company, 26. Drexel Burnham, 30–40, 42–48 Bonus Pool at 43–44 Cultural Clash at 42 Finance Department Changes at 43–44 High Value Added Course of 46 Medium-Sized Company Growth and 42–43 Milken's Phi-Erm within the Phi-Erm at 32–33 Self-Image Problem of 42 Shearson Moff IA at 43. Drexel Burnham Lambert. Annual Report of 1985, 255. Beverly Hills Headquarters of 80. Beverly Hills Savings Suit against 116–17 Bonuses paid by 247–48. California branch opened by 50–53 Charter of 206. Chinese Wall of 306–8 Client Concerns and 65, 67, 163, 177 Commitment Letters used by 107, 165–66, 182 Corporate Finance Group of 48–49, 63–69, 88, 98, 247, 250, 298, 302, 307 Corporate Finance Investment Partnership in 68, 299–300. Creativity of 135. Default on Highly Conference Ident. Letter of 182. Ebbing power of 333 to 43. Equitize slogan at 269. Equity of 66 to 67, 69 to 70, 246, 288 to 289, 306, 314. In financial scandals, 254 to 55. Formation of 48. Franchise arrangement of 10 to 11. Globalization of 243 to 44, 251 to 52. Go by as consultant for 62 to 66, 100 to 101, 163, 176, 245, 296, 299, 344 as God, 244 to 48. Green Tree lawsuit against 291, 292 growth of 80, 246 to 47. Highly Conference Ident. Letter of 101, 106 to 7, 166, 167, 182, 221, 250, 251, 290, 304, 344 High Yield Mutual Fund of C hits imitators of 248, 275 Internecine rivalries in 88, 299 to 301, 340 to 41. Joseph Doctrine of 170, 171. LBO Group of 100, 163 market share of 248 medium-sized companies and 13, 49, 347 to 50, 357, 358 merchant banking of 66, 248, 249 to 50. Milken's title at 84 1983 junk offerings of 78 to 80. Political Action Committee of 259 Political INFL units of 258 to 60, 264 to 65 Principal Mindedness of 59, 66, 67 Professor ITS of 19, 51, 64, 80, 98, 231, 247 to 48 Public Company Debate and 69 Public Relations Campaign of 1987, 348 to 50 Side deals of 74. Special Planning Committee of 74 Stability of 269 to 70 Stock of 69 to 70, 206, 247, 253. Third World Debt Project of 254, 2553. A. 9 deals of 76 to 77, 135, 209, 331. Underwriting Assistance Committee, UAC, of 72, 131, 235, 304 to 7, 351 Underwriting Default Rate of 77, War Chests, of 19, 117, 163, 164, 169, 180, 185, 202 as well-rounded Phi-ERM, 251 to 52, 253 Whatever It Takes to Win Credo of 341. World Trade Center Headquarters of 252, 333 Yin, Yang of Milken Operation in 57. Drexel Firestone, 23 to 24, 27 to 31, 43, 51, 271. Drexel Harriman Ripley, 24 to 27 Decline of 26 to 27 Lineage of 26 Securities Delivery System of 25 to 26. Drexel High Yield Bond Conference, 1979, 11 to 12. Drexel High Yield Bond Conference, 1983, 95. Drexel High Yield Bond Conference, 1984, 206. Drexel High Yield Bond Conference, 1985. See Predators Ball, 1985. Drexel High Yield Bond Conference, 1986, 182–83, 257–59, 291, 302. Drexel High Yield Bond Conference, 1987, 328. Dreyfus and Company, 151, 156. Dunmore Partners Limited, 81. Duval, Albert, 156–58. DWG, 122–23, 124, 139. Eagleton, Thomas F., 171. Eckel, Lee, 259. Economic Recovery Tax Act, 1981, 97. Economist, 270–71. Edersheim, Mauritz, 87. EGM Partners, 300. EJ Associates, 81. Encino, Caliph. 53–54. 80 Encounter Groups, T Groups, 62. Engel, Donald. 15, 18, 116, 117, 123, 125, 135, 183 Forced resignation of, 15, 337–39, 340–42 in Japan, 243. Joseph's reinstatement of, 338–42. Posner and, 121, 123, 338, 340. Prime Capital Associates and, 231–32. Revlon Battle and, 208, 218, 220, 230, 231–32. Englewood Partners, 328. Enterprise Fund, 89 Entertainment, 16, 60, 230 Equity, 45, 66–67, 69–70, 156, 325 in Beatrice Buyout, 250 of Drexel, 66–67, 69–70, 246, 288–289, 306, 314. Icon's views on 163 in leveraged buyouts, 99, 107, 108 in National Can Deal, 107, 108. Perelman's views on 236 in Phillips Deal, 167 preferred stock as 265 of Revlon, 216, 221, 225 risk and 131 tax law and 263 equity buyers, bond buyers versus 73. ESB 96. Evans Products 124, 125, 128, 139 exchange offers 66, 309–10, 312, 346 carrot and stick versus buyback, 76 registered, 75 in Revlon Battle, 216–17, 224–25, 226, 228 unregistered, 75–77, 124. Executive Life, 167, 280. Exxon, 272 Fallen Angels, Deep Discount Bonds, 27, 38, 44, 119, 346. Farley, William, 14, 109, 135, 163, 201. Farley Industries, 17. Far West Financial Services, 168. Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, 72. Federal Election Campaign Act, 259. Federal Home Loan Bank Board, 92, 115, 280. Federal Reserve. 37, 211, 212, 215, 264–65, 266. Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Company, 115–16. FGIC, Financial Guarantee Insurance Company, 283. Fidelity, 47. FIFI, First Investors Fund for Income, 33, 46–47, 56. Financial Corporation of America, 131. Financial Corporation of Santa Barbara, 343. Financial Guarantee Insurance Company, FGIC, 283. Finoran, Gerald, 353. Finsbury, 277–78. Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, 27, 30. First Boston Corporation, 30, 95, 248, 250, 253, 325. First City Financial, 168. First City Properties, 168. First Executive, 83, 89–90, 92–94, 124, 272, 276, 277, 281, 311. Atlantic Capital compared with, 280. First Investors Asset Management, 94, 277. First Investors Fund for Income, FIFI, 33, 46–47, 56. First Oak Financial Corporation, 280. First Stratford, 93, 281. Fischbach, 321–24, 352. Fitzpatrick, Dennis, 115. Flagstaff, 110, 111, 112, 160, FL Exable Balance Sheet, 75. Flight Transportation, 72–73, 306. Flom, Joseph, 101, 122, 157, 196, 206, 208, 226. Foman, Robert, 41 Food Business, 109–11. Forbes, 58, 70, 124, 155, 209, 270, 272–73, 322. Ford Motor Company, 42. Forstmann, Theodore, 222, 226. Forstmann Little & Company, 99, 219–28, 231. Fortune, 335-36-14D Documents, 133. Fox Filed, Icon Estate, 189, 190. Freyden, Stephen, 319. Freights, Joseph, 195. Freights Group, 195–96. Fraud, 72, 199–200. Freeman, Robert, 328–29. Freilich, Joseph, 151, 152, 153, 156. Freund, James, 106, 182. Friday, John, 43. Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver and Jacobson, 317. Friedland, Joel, 15. Fruhoff Bonds, 345. Fuqua Industries, 44. Fuss, Albert, 214, 277. Future Shock, Taf el 246 Futures Market, 251. Gable, Clark, 53. Gaff, 181, 213, 233, 245, 275–76, 287–88. Wicks compared with, 295. Galliff, Andrew, 265 Gambling operations, 58 to 60. Gandhi, Mohandas K., 357. Gardiner, Nancy, 236. GAM Saint Germain Depository Institutions Act, 1982, 91. Garrison Capital Corporation, 280, 284. Gateway Advisors, 83. GBL, Groupe Bruxelles Lambert SA, 206, 323. Gebauer, Antonio, 254–55. Gelson's, Encino Supermarket, 53. Janine, Harold, 194–95, 220, 239. General Electric, 256. General Felt Industries, 79. General Foods, 48, 221. General Motors, 94, 96. Gentry, Grant, 202–3, 220. Germain Monteil, 234. Getty, Anne, 236. Getty Oil, 164. Giant, Movie, 271. Gibson Greetings Deal, 99. Gillette Company, 234, 333. Giddis, Howard, 197, 202, 212, 214–215, 224, 232, 237. Glazer, Donald, 128–29. Glass-Steagall Act, 1934, 26. Gleacher, Eric, 101, 208–9, 217. GLJ, Milken Investment Partnership, 81, 82. Gluck, Henry, 308. Glucksman, Louis, 48. Goby, Cavas, 62–66, 100–101, 149, 163, 176, 245, 296, 299, 344. Goldberg, Arthur, 112–14, 118. Golden Nugget, 17, 58–60, 83, 168. Golding, Faith, 196, 198, 201, 202. Golding Family, 198. Goldman Sachs, 26, 30, 42, 49, 65, 69, 152, 248, 251, 252, 253, 318, 334, 335 earnings of 247 in financial scandals, 254–55 mergers and acquisitions and 95, 98, 200, 206, 231. Goldsmith, Jerry, 152, 153. Goldsmith, Sir James, 14, 17, 149, 205. Good, Daniel, 128, 140. Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, 251, 334. Gorin, Alexander, 113, 160–61. Grant, James, 266–68. Grant's Interest Rate Observer, 266. Great American, 36. Great American Management and Investment, GAMI, 305 Great Ideas, as, Born Bad, 63. Great Lakes International, 118. Greenhill, Robert, 210, 220 Greenmail, 18, 109, 118, 257, 263–264, 291. Icons use of 18, 109, 156, 157, 161–64, 169, 173 to 74 use of term, 155 to 56. Green tree acceptance, 290 to 91, 292, 326. Groupe Bruxelles Lambert SA, GBL, 206, 323. Gruntal, 151, 152. Guarantee Security Life, 134. Gulf and Western, 120, 161, 200, 258, 295, 322. Gulf Corporation, 231. Gulf Oil Company, 13, 100, 107, 164, 165, 167. Guterman, Gerald, 118 to 19. Gutfriend, John, 294. Hackle, Lori Ann, C. Milken, Lori Ann Hackle. Hadjin, Robert, 24. Hagman, Larry, 258. Halston, 236. Hammer, Armand, 258. Hammermill Paper Company, 156 to 158, 160. Harrods, 59. Harriman Ripley and Company, 26. Harris, Ira, 101, 122. Harris Graphics, 322. Harch, Joseph, 294. Harvard Business School, 57, 277. Hayden Stone, 41. Hayes, Samuel, 270. Hefner, William, 146. Harara, Caroline, 236. Hertzberg, Daniel, 320, 321 to 22, 329, 343. Hessel, Gail, 268. Heyman, Samuel, 149, 245, 275 to 76, 280. Milken's granting of autonomy to 287 to 88. Hickman, W. Braddock, 11, 28, 29, 33, 46. Highland, 154. Hiley Conference Ident. Letter, 166, 167, 182, 221, 250, 251, 290, 304, 344 use of term, 101, 106 to 7 high-yield bond funds, 46 to 47, 55 to 56 diversify ed. 46 high-yield bonds, see Chinese paper, fallen angels. Junk bonds, junk bond takeovers. Hilton Hotels, 17, 60. Hilton International Company, 233. Hits, Drexel's High Yield Mutual Fund, 79 to 80. Hoffman, Robert, 325. Home Insurance, 290. Home State Savings Banks, 159. Horowitz, Harry, 24, 53, 243, 260. House of Representatives, U.S., 259, 260. Hovnanian, 347, 349. Hudson, Rock, 271. Human Potential Movement, 62. Hunter, Katif I. Shish, 195. Hunter, Sam, 253. E. F. Hutton, 16, 40, 41, 47, 65, 128, 140, 346. IBG, Investment Banking Group, 339 to 40. IBM, 94, 298. Icon, Carl, 149 to 92, 245, 318, 332. ACF and 19, 161, 164, 169, 173, 185, 186, 190 to 91, 201. Air Fund and 102 Background of 150 to 51 Bluff and Bluster of 158 Career Path of 151 to 63 Commitment Letter demanded by 165 to 66 Control and Autonomy Concerns of 149 to 50 153 156 161 163 170 186 to 87 as dedicated capitalist 156 Drexel's post-Phillips relationship with 169 to 70 Gambling of 151 157 175 Greenmail used by 18 109 156 157 161 to 64 169 173 to 74 Image Consciousness of 172 178 186 Lawsuits against 157 159 to 60 171 to 72 Lifestyle changes of 189 to 90 Managerial talents of 185 to 86 191 Marshall Field bid of 113 159 to 161 189 Milken compared with 154 Milken's relationship with 18 to 19 170 186 to 87 288 National Can and 125 126 to 27 Negotiating abilities of 175 to 76 Philanthropy of 189 Phillips Petroleum and 13 19 107 163 to 71 173 191 203 at Predators Ball 1985 14 17 18 to 19 170 to 71 183 at Predators Ball 1986 183 Proxy Fi GHTS of 154 to 55 157 to 59 164 to 65 168 172 Tight Fi Steadness of 153 189 TWA Deal and 19 170 to 88 191 202 263 Uniroyal and 142 143 170 Unpretentiousness of 190 White Knight Transformation of 175 177 Icon, Libba, 190 Icon and Company, 149 to 92 Formation of 152 Kingsley's departure from 153 to 54 Kingsley's return to 154 Partners removed from 149 to 50 153 156 160 to 61 Schnall's stock in 151 153 Icon Group 179 ILP Investment Limited Partnership 278 Income Tax 37 96 Evasion of 139 Trusts and 34 INFL Asian 29 96 Ingersoll, Bruce 260 Insider Trading Boesky Day and C. Boesky Day Institutional Investor 270 307 341 to 42 Insurance Companies 134 207 272 280 282 Drexel's displacement of 246 private placements and 45 46 100 interest rates 63 70 71 91 263 to 64 281 283 leveraged buyouts and 111, 137. National Can Deal End, 137. Triangle Industries End, 108–9. International Nickel Company, 96. International Telephone and Telegraph, ITT, 194–95, 239. Investing in Junk Bonds, Altman, 268. Investment Banking, Investment Bankers, 63–66. Agent Mentality of, 64. Gambling Operations End, 59–60. Gambling Operations End, 59–60. Institutional versus Entrepreneurial 65, 66. Problems of Medium-Size Companies with, 43. Relationship versus Transactional, 63. Traders versus, 63–64. Investment Banking Group, IBG, 339–41. Investment Grade Companies, Def I Ned, 27. Investment Limited Partnership, ILP, 278. Irell and Manella, 54, 82. Jackson, Brooks, 260. Jacobs, Alan, 89. Jacobs, Irwin, 14, 15, 17, 164. Jacobson, Ben, 111. James, Anthony, 169. Jamie Securities, 35. Japan. Debt-to-equity ratios in, 262. Milken in, 243–44, 316. Jackwith, Peter, 196, 219. Jefferies, Boyd, 318, 329. Jefferies and Company, 128, 318. Jefferies Group, 329. Jews, 150, 154, 160. Anti-Semitism and 29, 36, 205, 331. In Burnham and Company, 31. Job formation claims, 348–50. Joseph, Fred, 40–46, 48–49, 58, 65, 66, 71–75, 250, 287, 296, 314, 335–41, 351–54, 359. Accountability factor of, 72–73. Ambitions of, 40, 44, 251–52, 253, 255, 302, 333, 334. Appointed Chief Executive of ICER, 251, 303, 336. Background of, 40–41. Boski Day and, 329, 335–37. Career path of, 41. Drexel Employee Views on, 337 as, Dr. Feelgood, 40, 341, Edge, Development Strategy of, 42–43, 44. Angle reinstated by, 338–42. Finance Department changes of, 43–44. Go-bys meetings with, 62–63, 100–101, 163, 176. Icon End, 170, 171. Lipton End, 205. Loyalty oaths considered by, 335. Management problem of, 301. Mergers and acquisitions and, 95, 97–98, 100–101. On Milken as contra-thinker, 70. Milken compared with, 40, 336, 337 as Milken's face, 40, 50, 303, 335, 354. Milken's Phi RST meeting with, 44. Milken's investment disclosure to, 68. Milken's yielding to, 303–4, 334 to 337 new paper invented by, 71 to 72 on overfunding, 290 on owner-managers, 67 political contributions of, 260 pragmatism of, 337 to 42 at Predators Ball, 1987, 329 recruitment efforts of, 101, 176, 251, 253, 255. TWA deal end, 170, 171, 176, 182. Volker end, 264.
Joseph, Stephen, 251. Joseph Doctrine, 170, 171 Junk bonds, junk bond takeovers, 12 to 15, 17 to 19, 44 to 49, 56 to 60, 90 to 100 Allura, 28 to 29, 46, 47 Commissions on, 46 Competition and, 47 to 48, 71, 209, 248 to 51, 287 Congressional Opposition to, 167, 203 to 7, 259 to 63 Crafting and fine aid tuning of, 13 Default rates and, 77, 268 Deterioration of, 268.
Drexel controls on, 72. Drexel's outrageous deals with, 72 to 75 explosion in, 1983, 78 to 80. Friday's criticism of, 43. Grant's views on, 266 to 67. Hickman's views on, 11, 28, 29. Icon end, 13, 163 to 66. 178 issuance of, 71, 78, 198, 247, 268, 306, 350. Japan end, 243 to 44 job formation claim end, 347 to 49 in leveraged buyouts, 98 to 100, 107 to 8 liquidity of, 46, 207, 285 margin rules end, 264 to 65 market sector of, 93-95% FIGUR end, 348 to 49 origin of term, 39. Peltz Mayuse of, 14, 115 to 16 as percent of total corporate debt, 268 prejudice against, 29, 57 recession of 1980 and, 70 to 71 research on, 32 risks versus rewards of, 11, 45 to 46, 73, 250 to 51. Rohatyn's criticism of, 206 to 7 selling techniques for, 32 start of Milken's interest in, 27 to 28 stock compared with, 28 to 29, 32 stock market crash, 1987, and, 344 subordinated debt and, 45 to 46. Treasury bonds compared with, 94, two-tiered, bust up, 204, 256. See also Specif IC Phi RMS. Justice Department, U.S., 260, 264. Kamerman, Morton, 200, 220. Kaminer, Daniel, 151, 152, 153. Kansa General Insurance Company, 281, 283 to 84. Contour, Edwin, 32, 34, 50, 51, 69, 83, 302, 308. Caesar's World Investigation End, 310 to 11. Kaplan, Mark, 34 to 35, 42, 59, 252. Katz, George, 14 to 15. K. David, 74, 97 to 98, 101, 116, 137, 164. Icon as viewed by, 163. Posner as viewed by, 121–22, 140. Kennedy, Edward M. 259. Kerkorian, Kirk, 304. Keystone B4, 33. Walter Kidder, 156. Kidder Peabody, 95, 101, 161, 173, 176, 253, 255–58, 308, 328, 335 stock of 256. Kindercare, 347. Kingsley, Alfred, 150, 152–54, 170, 187–89 background of 152. TWA and 172. Kissick, John, 298, 307, 308, 340. Klein, Calvin, 236. Kluge, John, 267. Knapp, Charles, 131–32, 146, 168, 284. Corner, Gerald, 291. Kohlberg, Kravis, Roberts, KKR, and Company, 65, 99, 125, 176, 245. Kravis, Henry, 125, 177, 245. Kroll, Jules, 72. Kugler, Michael, Jack, 253. Kuhn, Loeb and Company, 30 labor unions, TWA and 172, 174–178, 181, 183, 184. Lambert, Baron Leon, 48. Lasker, Bunny, 230. Lautenberg, Frank, 258. Law, Warren, 262–63. Lazard Frères, 65, 101, 196, 225, 231, 318 in financial scandals, 254–55. LBOs, see leverage buyouts. Lear Siegler, 257, 258, 295, 332, 334. Lesko, 36, 83. Le Club, Manhattan Night Spot, 230–31. Lehman Brothers Kuhn Loeb, 44, 47, 48, 65, 209, 268–69, 311. Lennox, Inc., 256 leveraged buyouts, LBOs, 97–99, 161, 198–99, 219, 224, 226, 246, 247, 269, 278, 289, 314, 325, 350. Leveraged buyouts, LBOs, 97–99, 161, 198–99, 219, 224, 226, 246, 247, 269, 278, 289, 314, 325, 350. Cash FL and 113. Def I Ned, 98–99. Friendly vs. Hostile, 167. Interest rates and 111, 137. Management and 98–99, 196. National Can Deal and 107, 108, 122–25, 137, 140, 148, 203. Phillips Deal as 166–67 private placements in 129 Ref I Nansing of, 163. TWA and 173, 181 of Uniroyal, 170. Levine, Dennis, 204, 208, 210, 220–221, 230, 312 Illegal activities of, 254–55, 318. Levine, Saul, 234–35. Levy, Gustav, 30, 42, 152. Levy, Paul, 75, 331. Lewis, Salim, Cy, 33–34. Liberty Service Corporation, 182. Lehman, Arthur, 194–96, 207–8, 216, 221–22, 225. Lindner, Carl, 12–13, 35–38, 57, 93, 119, 139, 165, 167–68, 205, 273, 290 Career path of, 36. Milken's respect for, 36. National Condil End, 124, 131, 132, 133 at Predators Ball, 1985, 14, 16, 17. SEC End, 35, 36, 37. Linton, Robert, 31, 59, 69, 243, 303, 336. Levine Scandal End, 254. Lipper Analytical Services, 33, 247. Lipton, Martin, 101, 168–69, 197, 259, 318. Drexel Business of, 206. Revlon Battle End, 204–6, 210, 211, 221, 224–25. Siegel's relationship with, 256 Takeover Raider Business refused by, 205, 206. Litton Industries, 120. Laban Associates, 81. Loeb Rhodes, 48. Lowe's Corporation, 35, 45. Lombard, Carol, 53. Long, Perrin, 247. Loomis, William, 209–10, 219, 222–224. Lord Abbot Bond Debenture, 33. Lorenzo, Frank, 173–78, 181, 187, 297.